Alright guys, BLM here, back with a new video. In this video, I'll be talking about my thoughts on the latest season of Survivor South Africa, the first all-star season for the series, Return of the Outcasts, which ends up being a very strong season here, mainly in line with that of the recent SA seasons for me, with me still standing by the fact that SA Production is the production team that I have the most confidence in nowadays out of any Survivor series. And despite this season having the 24 episode structure with multiple episodes a week, which is a format that I find to be poorly handled in Australian Survivor, I do feel like Survivor SA handled it the best that they could here, to where I didn't find myself annoyed by the existence of non-elimination episodes. And while I would have preferred it if the season had been structured normally and we didn't just have the season come and go over the course of only 6 weeks here, I didn't find this change to be as much of a hindrance on the season as I thought it could have been. Also, from a cast standpoint, I do feel like this cast for the most part delivered, where while there are a decent amount of questionable casting choice coming into the season, I do feel like most of those question marks ended up being solid additions here, with there obviously still being a few exceptions, but it still led to the season still being a consistently strong season from beginning to end. And like my other reviews, I'll be running through the season from beginning to end. So let's start that off with the premiere, which starts pretty typically with the players riding in on boats with confessionals being cut in along the way, but instantly we get introduced to the theme of the season, in this obviously being a returnee season, but one with a distinct tribe breakdown of pre-mergers versus post-mergers, a fan concept that had been floating around for a while, and one that I do think initially sets up some interesting storylines, particularly for the pre-mergers here, who inherently have this built-in redemption arc and underdog story here, facing off against players who made it further than them in the game, making this theme feel very similar to that of David versus Goliath, but in returnee form here. But an interesting aspect of this cast is that even for the post-mergers here, they are still players that didn't make Final Tribal, which I've talked about in the past of it being a questionable choice from my point of view, where it does limit some really great potential returnees, though at the same time I do feel like this was an intentional decision done to counter the current meta of all-star seasons, where players with massive reputations go home early, which I think partially worked out here, though there is obviously a glaring exception. But I do still wonder if it was still worth that compromise, but considering the amount of bigger names that were eligible that seemed to turn down this season, who knows if they could have even gotten these more notable names even if they didn't have this restriction here. And really, again, I do feel like the season turned out great even despite the current quality of casts, which even in itself still had the return of some figures I've been waiting to see back for a while and really never thought we would get these people back. People like a Shane and a Marion and a Tajin. It really was insane to see these people back on a modern season of the show here, and no matter what, that was something I was definitely excited for coming into it. But right away, from the opening confessionals, we do get some initial setup for major storylines moving forward. Starting with the pre-mergers, the Untitled tribe, we see Phil talking about making the most out of his return, which has been 8 years in the making, which despite an almost invisible edit in the first few episodes here, this ends up actually being a pretty great opening confessional for him. Dino gets a similar strong opening confessional talking about how he's going to change and not be this paranoid player as last time, which if this was Survivor US, I do feel like this would have made him a pretty top-edgic frontrunner off the bat. Shona instantly calls out Tanya and Pinty for being volatile players, which despite Tanya following that up with talking about not wanting to be Uranus and not repeating what happened last time, she does end up repeating that, which does end up being a trend on this season, with players talking about wanting to change the way that they play, just for the majority of them to end up making the exact same mistakes as last time. As for Masu, the post-merge tribe, we do hear from Steffi instantly talking about how clear of a target Chappies is, which to me again is really the only misstep I feel like there is from a casting point of view regarding threat level, as Chappies to me really just instantly comes off as the biggest threat on the board, where last season he was literally just one challenge away from winning the game and was also the fan favorite and a massive character, to where he was just such a blatant target coming into this season, which seemed to go against the purpose of this initial concept in a way that makes him stand out from this cast even more. And then we do get setup of some of the more important relationships from previous seasons, seeing Meryl talk about the target that her being there with Dante puts on her back, which ends up being a major storyline for her. We do see Shane having more positive feelings for Marion, calling her his blood sister, though Marion ends up talking about wanting to play her own game, though does talk about how him being there gives her confidence. And this personal journey for Marion here does really end up becoming one of the few major instances of personal content across this very game body season. But she does also get to mention that she was the merge boot, which gives her pre-merge energy, which did connect her to the theme this season, which again, had this been Survivor US, would have also been a great introduction here and also would have made her an instant Edgic frontrunner. Now we also end up getting set up to the PK Tevin potential rivalry that we sadly never end up getting to see come to fruition, with that being one of the more interesting storylines for me coming into the season, but sadly neither of them even end up making the swap here. Now once on shore, we do get content from many of those not introduced previously, making it so that most of the cast ends up getting content by the time that they arrive at their camps. But here we do learn about the prize money doubling to 2 million rand, which finally, and which even here, the prize money for a season is still less than an eighth of that of the Survivor US prize money, which seems kind of sad in comparison. But then we get to the first reward challenge, which ends up being a pretty physical one, which has become the norm in recent All-Star seasons, but this ends up being a callback to a challenge from season 7, where Steffi had walked on water, which is propped up as this big moment, but I'll be honest, I had no memory of it. But as expected here, especially considering how physical the Masu tribe seemed to be, they do end up winning pretty handily here. But then we finally get to the camps, where on Yantau we don't get too much focus around the tribe dynamics here, with a good chunk of time focused on how meager the supplies are, though we do get some alliance building, though really none of it truly matters, as none of these allegiances end up sticking moving forward, where like Tanya gets a lot of focus in trying to put together a women's alliance with Pinty, Teresa, and Killarney that did seem to be a solid one off the bat, but not too long from now we end up seeing the Tanya Pinty rivalry, and Tanya ends up clearly being on the bottom of the tribe. Also here right away we see that Pinty has not changed at all since her last season, with her getting called out for eating too much and getting in a confrontation with Shona, which leads to her having a very tumultuous run once again. We do get a good chunk of Sheamus, with him talking about how disappointing his first run was and how it really messed with him, and I did feel like this really set up a pretty interesting redemption arc for him that doesn't fully come to fruition, but he does end up getting off to a better start here with him building alliances with Dino and Tevin, with these alliances having differing results by the end of it. But also here Tevin gets a bevy of content, instantly coming off as the leader of the tribe, and we do get a lot of talk about his connection to Tony and PK, which did seem to be a pre-game relationship that most people had their eyes on, which did slightly surprised me, especially with the likes of Dante and Meryl and Shane and Marion coming into the season, to where they didn't seem to have that big of a targets on their backs. Yet these season 6 players do sadly end up all being relatively early boots, and some of that seeming to stem from this pre-game perception. Now on Masu, right away we do see Dante and Chappie's bonding, and instantly Dante comes off as a way more aggressive strategic player here than he did the first time around, but seeing Chappie seemingly pick up Dante and also having a pre-game relationship with Steffi, and later also seeing him be a part of the majority alliance that ends up forming, where he gets pulled in largely due to these connections, it did really seem like he was actually well positioned coming out of this first episode, only for all that to crumble almost instantly following this. But the core of this majority alliance ends up being the group later dubbed as the full package in Marion, Meryl, and Steffi, who instantly bond here, with each of them ending up being power players on this season, and each bring in their number 1 allies to form the Breakfast Club, this 6-person alliance that seemed poised to dominate the game here. But through this, the other 4 members of the tribe also seem to come together as well, with PK and Tony being the heads of that side, and also having Tajin and Palessa alongside them. Though most of their storyline here does revolve around Tony being talked about as an emotional player, as she was last time, and PK already being set up as a target for being perceived as the leader of that side. That did seem mostly unperpetuated, as he did seem to be playing way more passively on the return here, though we do also get some drama from the reveal that PK and Marion had hooked up in the past, and there's still being some bad blood between the two that seemed to further split these two groups, with Marion seemingly locked in on targeting the PK Tony duo and using the information that they have matching tattoos with Tevin in order to put an even bigger target on their backs, really making Marion come off instantly as the most aggressive player on this tribe off the bat. But this episode does conclude with the first visit to the Outpost, this season's version of the generic island mechanic that is used to divvy out advantages, making the premiere a non-elimination episode, which, while not ideal, I did like that it gave us more time to spend with this cast before the first elimination here, essentially making this a 2-hour premiere, but one spread across 2 different days. But again, considering the schedule that was forced upon them by the network, I do again feel like they did the best they could do here in utilizing their time, and this also works as a very solid break-off point for the episode, where for the Outpost, we do have both tribes having to send 2 people to negotiate for supplies, and we see Sheamus and Teriso going for Yantao, while Shane and Steffi go for Masu. And the actual negotiation itself ends up being mostly boring, though it was interesting to see Yantao being able to get the upper hand on Masu here and getting both flint and food. But the actual end of the episode is the reveal of another twist, where we will have all 4 here vote for someone not at the Outpost who will receive the Outpost Idol, an idol only valid for first tribal, and if the one that holds that idol doesn't go to tribal, they will have to attend tribal and hand that idol off to someone else. And really, I do like this twist here. It's obviously a choice that has a lot of layers to it, where you can choose to give the idol to the weakest member of the opposition to weaken that tribe. You can give it to an ally to give your alliance more power. You can use this choice to bolster your pre-game relationships or even build new ones. I do feel like this is a twist that could have been used in a number of different ways, also adding more cross-tribal relationships that can form through the Outpost. And this can also expose tribe dynamics and pre-game relationships, while also, at the end of the day, not being that dissimilar of a twist to those that we've seen in the past of these like one-round idols that are only good at the beginning of the game. So again, overall, I felt like this was a very good addition here. Though with that, let's jump to episode 2, which does start with the Outpost players talking through the twist, where it did seem like Masu wanted to make an agreement here, but instead Sheamus decides to not compromise, which does start his bit of negative content after having a pretty solid premiere where Teriso calls him out for not having any tact. But this leads to 2 different approaches to the vote, where Masu ends up voting for Tanya as Yantao's weakest member, while Yantao ends up voting for Tevin as their strongest member. And at the immunity challenge, we do get to see the vote results, where it ends up being a tie, and we do get a rock draw to decide who gets the idol, and that ends up being Tevin. And with Yantao surprisingly winning immunity, Tevin now has the power to save someone on the opposite tribe, which also added an interesting dynamic to the vote here, of them having to guess who he's going to save. But as for the events back at camp on Yantao, we do see Tanya being looked at as the easy first vote, and Sheamus ends up calling her out as the weakest player, once again showing his lack of tact here. But this does transition to seeing them talk about who Tevin's going to play the idol for, where it did seem like most of the tribe had agreed on using it on Palessa as a good plan, though we do follow this up with seeing Felix put in some work to get him to play it on Dante, again adding this interesting dynamic of these cross-tribal lines and pre-game relationships playing a factor here. And with Dante also being a potential target moving forward, it did add a lot of intrigue here, though realistically none of this actually ends up mattering, as he does play it for Palessa and it doesn't end up changing any vote result here. But again, it ends up being really great to see all the dynamics that this idol ends up bringing out. Now obviously most of the episode does end up focusing around the Masu tribe, where we do get a really train wrecky series of events that completely flipped what we had seen in just the previous episode, with this all starting off with Chappies deciding to dig for an idol in the middle of the night, with Steffi deciding to help him, and Dante awakens to seeing them seemingly turning against Chappies in an instant, which he later states that it was because it should have been him digging with Chappies, not Steffi, which made it sound like he voted Chappies out because he was jealous of Steffi. But here we do also hear from the other players like Tony about not wanting to deal with Chappies, and having to worry about what he's going to do at night. And really at this point, it felt pretty clear that Chappies was going to be the boot here. Though really, I do feel like this, while a misstep on Chappies' end, isn't that major of one. And really, I do feel like he was more so targeted due to his perception from the previous season. And also we have to factor in the fact that Tevin had the idol on the opposite tribe, which probably scared the members of the Breakfast Club from going after PK or Tony, who they had assumed that Tevin would play the idol for. So I do think this was a series of unlucky circumstances that led to Chappies being the clear target here. But again, we do see Dante take a really aggressive strategic approach to the vote here, with him gathering the numbers together to take out Chappies and splitting the vote between him and Shane. Again, him essentially targeting two members of the Breakfast Club alliance here, which again is really insane to see this alliance crumble so quickly after seeming like a dominant force in that first episode. But along the way, we do see Shane picking up on the fact that people are scheming around him, making him now want to target Dante, which was a really fun touch to all this, and something that was pretty unexpected from my point of view, as Shane is someone that in the preseason was very adamant about targeting Chappies. And for it to turn out here to where he is one of the few people not targeting Chappies ends up being a pretty funny turn of events here. But we do end up seeing Shane scramble here to get the votes onto Dante and fails to even get Marion on board, really starting off his season on a bad note here. To see him so out of the loop on what is going on here, thinking that he had the votes on Dante, only for it to turn out that he's literally the only person going that way. But we do get a really fun tribal where we do get some whispering between Tony and Marion. We do get a pretty insane vote where three of the biggest guys on the tribe are getting votes at the first tribal of the season, but it does end up being a 5-4 to 1 vote, landing onto Chappies as expected, though this was still a really great tribal to start the season off. But with that, let's talk about Chappies, who again, I do feel like had a pretty unsurmountable target coming into this season, with him being such an outlier on this cast of being the player that made it the furthest on their original season, and just coming off of the latest season of the show, while also being known for some non-desirable things as a tribe mate. So I do feel like he was doomed from the start here, but even I was surprised to see him ending up being the first boot after that first episode, where it did seem like he got some decent content, got himself into a solid position, but again, it all crumbled around him so quickly here. That really just showed you how dynamic this season was going to be. But now let's jump into episode 3, which ends up being our first standard episode of the season, which is where we do see what would become the typical episode structure of the season, where we do get short camp life scenes at both camps at the start of the episode, but really early on we do end up getting around to the immunity challenge that will typically have a reward portion to it too, but really most of the episode's events end up occurring after the immunity challenge, which is a format I am pretty conflicted on. I mean, while in most scenarios it doesn't end up mattering too much, I do feel like at points it does make the content on the winning tribe seem less important, as it ends up mostly being set up for future events more so than what's going to happen in this specific round. And for the losing tribe to have the scrambling of the vote here being broken up by having scenes of the opposite tribe also breaks up the momentum of the scramble, while also further minimizing the impact of the content from the winning tribe, as you're just more interested in what's going to happen on the opposite tribe, as that's what's going to matter for this episode. So again, it's not really that major of an issue here, but I do feel like it's not my ideal episode structure. Though I can also see the benefits of it, as you do technically get more time to spend on the scramble from the winning tribe, even though again it is more spread out throughout the episode than what we would see from like a Survivor US episode. But as for the challenge itself, we do end up seeing Yantai win immunity once again, working together really well, while we do see the egos on the Masu tribe really getting in their way. Now, Yantai's content does mostly revolve around the Tanya-Pinty rivalry, where right away we do see Tanya getting upset at Pinty for eating too much food, leading to us seeing Pinty sneaking off with food in what seems like a very Chappies-inspired moment. But we do see the tribe clearly knowing what she's doing, and this leads to Tanya confronting her, all clearly being set up to one of the two being the first boot from the tribe, with this episode really highlighting Pinty in a much more negative light, which is a trend I noticed moving forward, in that while the Survivor SA editing style is one that blindsides the viewer less often by the time of the actual boot, I did like how they edited the episodes before those boots, where I did feel like they intentionally edited them in a way that would make you think that the opposite figure within a conflict would go home, as obviously Tanya ends up being the first boot from this tribe. Though again, this episode primarily focuses around Pinty's negative traits, just so they can flip around that perspective by the next episode, to make you think that she's going to be the initial boot, only to flip around that perspective by the next episode. But also here we do get a bit of a strange storyline with Teresa, seeing her look for an idol and talking about her being nervous that someone else is going to find it, so she ends up coming up with a plan to stop other people from looking, where she spreads information that Tevin already has the idol. And this just felt very ridiculous to me, where while as a whole on this season I was pretty pleased with the potential that Teresa demonstrated here, I did also feel like this was a major question mark from her, where this really makes no sense. I mean, this could have easily backfired on her and blown up her spot, especially had Tanya not taken the blame for it instead. And this really just felt like a really short-sighted move, and one that ironically ends up leading to Tevin leading the entire tribe and looking for the idol together, which felt like a very Boston Rob style move for him. Though through this we do see Sheamus find the idol in front of the entire tribe, which ends up being an idol only valid up until the third round, which ends up being a common occurrence on this season to have these shot clock idols. Though through that actually guarantees that Sheamus is going to survive his first tribal, which good for him. But most of the action of this episode does happen on Masu, where we actually started the episode with Steffi being upset over losing Chappies and being on the wrong side of the votes. But almost instantly, we do see the Breakfast Club get back together, which was really bizarre to see this alliance that had broken up and voted against each other in the previous round come back together and remain to hold control into the merge. But Marion really ends up getting the mastermind edit in this episode and getting the group back together and leading the vote against the PK Tony contingent, while at the same time we do see PK and Tony targeting Marion as well, which does lead to us getting a bit of ickiness here, where we do see Tony using Marion's skin condition as a way to justify her being the weakest member of the tribe and using it as a reason to vote her off, which really just feels wrong to me. I mean, it definitely feels like a low blow to use someone else's medical condition as a way to put the target on them, and it just felt like a move that was mostly unnecessary, as I felt like there were just other easier ways and better justifications to put the target on Marion in this spot. But we do end up seeing Marion find out about this and get really emotional, and this ends up furthering the bond between Marion and Steffi to where they become a solid final two moving forward, and together they do end up finding the diplomatic immunity advantage, which just felt weird that this was randomly hidden at camp, but it's a fine advantage, obviously a counter to being swap screwed, and essentially can be used as immunity if it's used immediately after losing a challenge. So again, it's fine. They're not really an advantage that I'm like hyped to see back here. Though we do also later find out that there's another one at the other camp as well, but only one of these advantages can be played, and when one is played, the other one ends up being useless, and I just felt like that was just kind of a pointless rule. Though the hiding of this advantage does lead to a pretty interesting moment moving forward, but the Breakfast Club does become solidified here in voting for PK over Tony, which did feel like a questionable move from my point of view, considering the pregame relationships that Tony had. But either way, we do get an interesting tribal where we get some bickering between Tony and Marion, and it all leads up to a 5-4 PK blindside. And losing PK here was another really big blow to the season to me, where again, I was so excited to see how his return would go, particularly with his connections to Tony and Tevin, but it did feel like those connections made him an instant target. I think through that and also his Jade relationship with Marion, who ended up being very well connected in her own right, it really just felt like it left PK with very little room to maneuver here. And again, the fact that we didn't get to see him reunite with Tevin, which was one of the more interesting storylines to me coming into the season, ends up being an underwhelming end to PK's run here. But then let's jump into episode 4, which starts with Tony being really upset over the PK boot and really just exemplifying the more emotional nature that people were expecting from her, where she does end up confronting the entire tribe and talks about how dumb it was to get rid of PK as it would weaken the tribe, which is coming from one of the spearheads of the Chappies boot. But this leads to this big fight between Dante and Tony, which did seem to spark some trauma from Tony, with her talking about Dante reminding her of the men that abusively yelled at her. And obviously Tony has every right to feel this way, and you can feel sympathetic for her in that light. But at the same time, I also don't feel like Dante did anything wrong. Where, I mean, yes, he did lose his temper, but it really wasn't anything that seemed any more extreme than your typical reality TV fight. And we do end up seeing them fight again the next morning, where Dante refuses to apologize. And this really does start this Dante-Tony rivalry, and also starts Tony's position as a social pariah, and really sets her up as the obvious boot had this tribe ever gone to tribal again. Now, it is also here where we do see the formal formation of the full package, which ends up being probably the most solid alliance in the game at this point, and seem to be the core of the main power structure for a lot of the game. Now, in Yantao, we do see this pretty scary moment of Dino falling in the fire, which thankfully he didn't need to get pulled from the game for, but I did worry that a dumb injury like this could get him voted out earlier than expected, though thankfully it didn't end up playing much of a factor here outside of him having to sit out of the immunity challenge. Which that challenge ends up leading to Masu finally winning immunity, to which they get a future life breakfast bar, which did contain a lot of scrambling for an idol, though no one found anything. But as for Yantao, a lot of the episode still focuses around this Pinty-Tanya rivalry, and we do see Tanya constantly campaigning against Pinty to Tevin and Sheamus, who really seem to be out in front here as these decision makers for the tribe. And in retrospect, it did seem like Tanya was more willing to work with them moving forward than Pinty, to where I do think it ends up being a bit of a misstep for them to let her go, especially from Tevin's point of view, where it did feel like Tanya was really confiding a lot in Tevin, and instead he just takes a more passive approach to this round, with telling Tanya that he'll vote with her if she's able to get the votes first, instead of actively campaigning for her. Which I do think if he did, he probably could have gotten the numbers together, considering it felt like a lot of the tribe was conflicted on which of the two to end up voting out here. Though at the same light, we do see Tevin talk about not wanting to work with emotional players, and Tanya is obviously the epitome of that. And we see more of that where we do see her fight with Pinty once again, where she tells her to not forget her humanity and scolds the rest of the tribe for allowing Pinty's behavior. And it really feels like she just loses it here, where her annoyances with Pinty really just transforms for her into this grander moral issue of right and wrong, and her having to stand up for what's right. And this really just felt ridiculous and seemed to further cement Tanya as the obvious boot here. But following this, we do get a funny scene of Tanya hiding in a spy shack, watching a conversation between the other women, only for her to come out of the spy shack and just tell them that she was watching them in her spy shack, which was just ridiculous. But before Tribal, we do get a couple other fun storylines to point out here. First up, really, this episode ends up being a pretty major coming out party for Phil, who again had been near invisible in the first 3 episodes, but obviously becomes a major focal character moving forward. But here he really explodes in content as this really fun confessionalist, especially in how he ends up mocking the players in confessional while still playing it straight to their face. And this does also lead to a bit of a red herring of Phil considering flipping the vote to save Tanya, though it obviously doesn't end up going anywhere, though that did seem to stem from Phil not trusting Sheamus and wanting to weaken Sheamus by taking out Pinty, which, based on what we've been shown, didn't really seem to make much sense. But we do also see some talk from Sheamus about playing the idol on Pinty, though obviously that doesn't happen either. But also we get this fun little moment from Shona of her making a fake idol that she ends up hiding at Tribal, in the case that she ever needs it for the future, which ends up being a pretty unique idea here, and one that has a really funny resolution by the end of it. But again, the Tribal itself was pretty clear that we were getting a Tanya boot, though we do get some more fighting between Tanya and Pinty at Tribal as well, and losing Tanya here did feel right for the season. I mean, I don't really know how much more she had to give to the season, as I feel like she brought enough intrigue to these first few episodes to where it made her a notable, entertaining figure here, but one that didn't overstay her welcome, and one that obviously doesn't get dragged to the very end, which I do think would have been a likely scenario had she been able to make it to a swap position. But considering her being the first boot from her tribe here, and in a very explosive way, and her also almost being the first boot the last time around had she not been saved by the Island of Secrets, I do feel like there's at this point a very serious debate for Tanya being the worst player in the history of Survivor SA at this point. But now for episode 5, which ends up being an episode almost solely revolved around Yontao, with Masu not having much to do here, with us just getting more of the Tony-Dante rivalry, with Tony still being on the bottom, though we do get introduced to an interesting strategy from Dante's end, where we get him talking about taking out all the other alpha males in order to make his presence more necessary, as at that point they would really need him for challenges, and really the strategy just seems extremely short-sighted, where this is essentially the opposite of the meat shield strategy that has become a major part of the current meta. But again, it became a part of the meta for a reason, and with Dante here taking out all these other alpha figures, it does lead to Dante being way out in front, in a position where moving forward, it really just did not feel like he had a chance of making it to the end due to how massive the target on his back was. But also here we do get the start of this weird relationship between Dante and Palessa, with Palessa pretending to be working with him, when in reality she is plotting to take him out, though at the same time Dante is looking at her as one of his numbers, which furthers this notion that Dante's days are numbered. But this is also the episode where Steffi ends up finding her idol, which does end up being a fully powered idol, which I really don't love how variant these advantages that are found around camp end up being. I do find it to be really arbitrary that at points these idols can have varying levels of longevity. Also, sometimes they find a pretty minuscule power, while other times it's a full-blown idol. So again, I just feel like this was an unnecessary amount of variance that was added to the game here. Though here, Steffi ends up talking about wanting to keep the idol secret, though by the next episode, she ends up telling Marion anyway, though it does end up further solidifying them as a duo there. Now, Masu also ends up winning immunity here in what is a really physical competition that really just leads to embarrassing loss for the Yontao tribe. And really, this entire episode just ends up being this massive downfall for Tevin and Sheamus, where across the episode, we have numerous players talking about how they're running the tribe and how they don't trust them, ranging from Phil to Pinty to Teresa, really making obvious that they were being prepped for a fall here. But interestingly here, Tevin is instead the focus of all this negativity instead of Sheamus, where again, the last few episodes have been mostly revolved around Sheamus being looked at as a sketchy figure, which really felt like them again playing with your expectations to make this upcoming boot a pretty big shocker, especially considering how much positive content Tevin had gotten up until this point that really highlighted him as the leader of the tribe and showing him as a pretty effective player, only for that to all crumble around him here, where we do see most of the tribe agreeing to vote out Pinty, making Tevin feel extremely comfortable here, which you would think that he would have learned his lesson from what happened to him last time, but this does end up being a really tragic downfall for Tevin, with him also ending up finding an idol along the way, making it clear that he was going to be blindsided with it in his pocket, making this even more dramatic of a downfall for him, with him even saying that he will never leave this game due to overconfidence again. But at the same time, seeing all these pieces come together to take him out was really riveting TV, where we do see Pinty do her fair share of campaigning. We see the likes of Teresa and Dino and Phil already thinking that Tevin had to go, and we do end up seeing Felix being convinced of going along with this as well, which is where we finally see an extremely important alliance for the future form in the No BS alliance coming together, though strangely they don't get as much of a focus as what you would expect them to get, considering how important they do end up becoming later on. But we do see Dino and Phil get Felix on board, and we do see them tell Pinty to go off at Killarney at Tribal, which we do see go through as a way to further snow Tevin into thinking that he's safe, and everything ends up going according to plan, all leading up to this fantastic 5-4 vote where Tevin doesn't play his idol and seems to realize once the first Tevin vote comes up that he's screwed, and he starts packing his bags, which, while disappointing to see his run end so early, if it were to end as early as it did, I do feel like this is as satisfying of a way as it could have ended. But at the same time, while a fantastic move here from the No BS Alliance, which allows them to take control of the tribe moving forward, I do also feel like this was the start of the downward trajectory for the pre-mergers as a whole that does lead to only 4 of them being left in the game by the time of the merge, where this group has been really solidified before this round, working cohesively, which ends up being such a boon for them over the Masu tribe, who were more of this train wrecky tribe. But this vote does lead to major fractures within the tribe that can be attributed to Killarney later flipping against the group after the swap, and also I do feel like Tevin was such a major proponent of the pre-merger sticking together, which, I mean, to be fair, benefits his own game, as he is clearly one of the pre-merger's strongest members, to where this sentiment would help keep him around. But Tevin did at least seem to want to keep this group together moving forward, though at the same time, considering an impending swap and Tevin potentially getting back together with Tony, and also supposedly Tevin already having plotted to get rid of Phil in the near future, it does make sense to make the move here, though one that I do think in retrospect probably caused a lot of fractures within the tribe. But losing Tevin here was a massive blow to the season. Really disappointing to see him go home early once again. Again, he is a player that has demonstrated so much potential now on 2 separate runs, and neither of them leading to him being able to execute on that potential. But again, it was a spectacular downfall for him here to show his overconfidence catch up to him again. But despite 2 early exits now, I still would like to see him get another shot, because again, I do think he has a really strong strategic mind for the game. Mind you, I think he'll always struggle with threat management, but I do feel like on any normal season, he should have an easy run to the merge, but due to some strange circumstances on both of his seasons now, he does end up being a pre-merge boot instead. Now let's jump into episode 6, which ends up being one of the more straightforward episodes of the season, but one that does provide another great downfall episode, but this time for Sheamus, with the episode starting off with him being upset over the Tevin boot, and we see him confront Dino about it, setting up this interesting dynamic between the two, with Dino clearly wanting to work with Sheamus moving forward, but Sheamus instead using this as an opportunity to try to blindside him, which leads to the plan blowing up in his face. But strangely, we do get a reward challenge in this episode, which felt weird considering we don't get many of those across the entire season, and considering this was just a standard round, I don't get why they just randomly added one here. But through this, it does lead to this episode being structured more similarly to your typical US episode, with the actual immunity challenge not happening until much later in the episode. And we do get an interesting reward where the winning tribe gets to pick 2 people from the other tribe to join them, and we see Yantao win and pick Tony and Tajin as the 2 who were clearly on the outs at that point. But weirdly, the reward itself ends up being decided by a wheel where they spin it to pick what they're going to eat, and really most of these options seem pretty mediocre, so if I was a player in the game, I definitely would have been underwhelmed by this. But through this, we do end up seeing Tony spilling information to Yantao, particularly throwing Dante under the bus, while at the same time we do end up seeing Tajin call her an emotional player once again, and proceeding to even rat her out to Shane back at camp, which leads to nothing, but further shows Tony as a social pariah here. Also through this challenge, we do end up seeing the start of Dante's obsession with Dino winning the puzzle for the tribe, and we see Dante openly say, "This is why we need to get Dino out." And him being so tunnel visioned on taking Dino out ends up blinding him moving forward in the game, with him being unsuccessful in doing so, while also him not recognizing the fact that he's being further pushed out of his own alliance. But Masu ends up winning immunity here, despite constant arguing throughout the challenge, leading to the rest of the focus being on Yantao, where we see Sheamus trying to flip the vote onto Dino by roping in the other 2 players blindsided by the Tevin vote in Killarney and Shona, both of which end up ratting him out to Dino. And just in general, it did feel like Sheamus greatly overestimated the amount of control that he had here, in a similar way to how he played in Philippines. That obviously led to him being the first boot there, and he ends up showing a lot of those same flaws here, where we do see him then approaching Pinty and Teresa, who end up lying about being on his side, and we have Teresa just mocking him in confessional, to where it does make him come off in a very doofusy way here. But also when Dino ends up hearing about this blindside plan, you can tell that he is genuinely disappointed, as it really did not feel like he wanted to take Sheamus out at this point, but now because of Sheamus campaigning against him, he is essentially forced to make this move. And coming into Tribal, while there wasn't any suspense, as clearly Sheamus was going to be blindsided here, blindside still made for decent TV from my eyes, where you could see the clear disappointment on Sheamus's face when the first vote for him comes up, where he clearly knew that his plan backfired on him, and we see him turn to Dino, where Dino explains himself to Sheamus on his way out, which for me would have been a disappointing way for Sheamus to go here. And initially I did think of it as like a really sad outcome for Sheamus, this guy who mentioned being in a really dark place after his initial run, but instead he ends up coming out of this seemingly content with the experience, which ends up making his downfall here a bit more satisfying under the light of him seeming to take the loss a lot better here. And Sheamus certainly had an interesting run here, being one of the players I was expecting to change the most on the return, considering how much introspection he talked about going through since his first season, and him obviously wanting to avoid being the first boot once again. And while he certainly does improve upon his first appearance, it wasn't as big of an upgrade as I was expecting it to be, and really he just seemed like the same player here once again, being a bit overconfident and hyper strategic in a way that turned other people off. He really demonstrated a lot of the same flaws as Tevin, but I do feel like he did more actively bad work to lead to his eventual downfall here. And considering this was coming off the back of what should have been a decreased threat level coming off of being a first boot, I do get the sense that Sheamus, just overall as a player, will always struggle with the same flaws every time he plays. But for episode 7, which ends up being the second of the non-elimination episodes, but this one making a lot of sense, and why it is one where we do get the swap. Through that obviously introduces a number of new storylines and new dynamics that, again, makes this a natural round to make into a two-parter. Now, not much of interest actually happens before the swap here, where we really just get more of the same negativity for Pinty, with her continuing to annoy the likes of Shona and Killarney, with her bragging about the Sheamus blindside. We also have Phil annoyed at her for isolating them when they should be expecting a swap, and we also see Dino being annoyed that she ends up calling him paranoid. So really not a great showcase of Pinty's gameplay here. While on Masu, we do end up seeing the continuation of the Tony-Dante rivalry, and we see the likes of Steffi and Palessa talking about taking out Dante, with Palessa's side of things mattering a bit more in the short term here. But then we have the players leaving for a challenge, where we obviously end up getting the swap, which is conducted in a strange way here, with the players having to pick a random podium and then are handed out random vials that have colored liquids in them that will determine which tribe they go to. Really just another way of randomly swapping the players here, which I will say I was slightly disappointed that we just got a typical swap. I was kind of hoping for a cool callback here to Champions, for them to utilize that swap mechanic where they ingrain the tribe swap into a challenge, but realistically it is easily gamed that way, to which I understand why they didn't end up using it here, but I do think it could have worked in this position with so many cross-tribal relationships, though again it still could have led to a pretty boring tribe breakdown. But as for the tribes, we do end up seeing the dynamics flip here, where Yonto has a majority on Masu and vice versa, with the new Yonto being made up of the entire Breakfast Club alliance outside of Steffi, who is swapped out for Palessa, and then we also have Dino and Phil there as the only original Yonto members, who are clearly on the bottom. While on new Masu, we see that Yonto now has the 4-3 majority, but a very precarious one, with Killarney being a really loose number there. Though the Masu members there end up being Tony and Tajin, who were on the outside of the original tribe, and Steffi, who on paper should have been swap screwed here. And the fact that she does get out of this in an even stronger position is extremely impressive, to where even by the end of this episode, we see her do really effective work in pulling over Killarney, and which allows the old Masu to hold control here after a swap in a position where he really shouldn't have. But also here we do end up seeing Shona end up getting a yellow vial, which typically we would see that person being sent to exile for a round, but instead we get a twist similar to what happened on Australian Survivor Blood vs. Water, where Shona gets to pick which tribe she goes to, which she ends up making a questionable choice here in picking the new Yonto, a position where she actively picks a tribe where she's going to be in the minority, which, while it does lead to her being the first boot from this tribe, and also I just think going to the other tribe would have been a softer landing spot for her, I also do understand why she makes this choice, as it does actually have two major benefits to it. The first and really most important of them is the fact that she is now with her two closest allies in Dino and Phil, who obviously got swapped together to the Yonto tribe. While she doesn't have nearly as many connections with the people on the other tribe, outside of maybe Killarney, but also by Shona joining this Yonto tribe, she actually opens up an opportunity for Dino and Phil there, where if she did not go to that tribe, one of Dino or Phil would have been guaranteed to be the first boots if they were to go to tribal, as the opposition can split the vote at that point, while with Shona there, they can't, as it is a 5-3 split now, meaning that they would need to swing someone over in order to be able to split the vote, meaning that one of the three there were able to find an idol, which they do. They would be in position to pull off a massive blindside, which we almost see happen here. Now in Yonto, we do get a fun little moment of Shona annoying everyone while showing them around camp, and her telling people that they can't go through people's bags, only for us to cut to Shane, who then proceeds to look in people's bags, which was a fun little callback there. Here we also get the foundation of the Phil-Marion relationship, which ends up being a pretty important one for both of them moving forward. But here we also get the continuation of the Dante-Dino rivalry, with Dino talking about how Dante is running the tribe, and we do see him getting picked to go to the Outpost, which does end up returning in this episode, which again makes sense considering the episode structure, though interestingly we barely get any content on Masu before the Outpost, where we just see them do a random draw and Taejin gets picked, which for the old Yontao that felt like a bit of a misstep there to allow an old Masu member to go. But at the Outpost we do get some ridiculousness from Dante trying to subtly convince Taejin to work with Felix, which doesn't come off as subtle at all. Instead puts a target on Felix's back, with Taejin talking about wanting him out before the merge now, which doesn't happen, but funny to see this plan just completely blow up in Dante's face. But outside of that, they also end up getting idol clues, which we do end up seeing Dante find right away, while Taejin doesn't. But we find out that these idols have very wonky rules, where it is an idol for the opposite tribe and one that is only valid until the merge, which in itself is not that restrictive, as I do feel like there are a lot of fun opportunities to have with that, especially immediately after swap and also with pre-game relationships. But also another rule here that I don't like is the fact that this idol has to be given away the round when it's found, which is a rule that to me is just kind of dumb. I mean, like, if the idols are only valid until the merge anyway, why are we also putting a limitation on when the idol has to be given away? I mean, I get it from a producer standpoint of them wanting the idol to be in play, so forcing you to give up the idol at the first opportunity makes it so that's more likely for the idol to be actually in the game with powers. But I do feel like it also opens up the opportunity for what happens here, where Dante ends up finding it only for Taejin to not find it, which means that they can't swap the idols here, and instead Dante is now left with the expired idol, with him deciding to not give it to anyone on the other tribe. Though at the same time, I will say that I do think Dante does actual good work here in how he utilizes this idol moving forward. But I think in a lot of scenarios, this could have just been a dud of a twist. And really, I just feel like this season does go a bit overboard in how much it limits the power of a lot of the idols that are in the game here. But we do end the episode with the immunity challenge, which ends up being a really physical wrestling comp. The one where you have to roll the ball through the goal, a challenge that we have seen play out a couple times on Survivor US, we saw it on Survivor China, and then we saw it disastrously play out on Philippines, where we got this massive standstill to where they had to stop the challenge and call it a tie, which makes it questionable to me why they would want to use this challenge here. And we see it play out in the worst possible way, where we see Steffi injuring her knee right away and having to be carried out by the medics, and we end the episode with this really gruesome cliffhanger of Pinty having landed on Shona, to which we hear Shona screaming out in pain, which was just such an unsettling way to end this episode. And also seemed a bit insensitive for them to end on a cliffhanger of like, oh, is she going to be medevaced or not? But this obviously transitions to episode 8, where we do see Shona being pulled out of the challenge, and we still continue on after that, getting a sudden death round once again, which in itself still lasts for over an hour, which really just shows you how much this challenge sucks. But Masu eventually ends up winning, and we do see Yontao get really emotional after having put in that much work and having a tribe mate injured, and despite all that, still end up losing the challenge, which must be extremely demoralizing there. Now afterwards, Masu doesn't get that much content, though here we do see the initial alliance come together, where Teresa approaches Taejin about pulling in Tony and Felix, and that being a 4 moving forward, and they agree to take out Killarney first. Though at the same time, we again see Steffi further solidify her bond with Killarney, which ends up putting Taejin and Tony in the swing position for whenever they eventually go to Tribal, to which when they do, I do feel like they make a questionable decision. But again, most of the episode does revolve around Yontao, where we probably get the most dynamic round of gameplay so far in this season, where we started off with Dino clearly being on the bottom and worried about going home, where we do get a major highlight on his relationship with Phil, who continues to pop out as a character here with some really fantastic confessionals. But also we get worry from them of Shona not coming back to the game, as again, Shona being there greatly benefits them, to where they have an easy target for the opposition to take out, while also stopping them from properly splitting the votes. And we do see Dino going all out here in campaigning against Dino, and is completely unsuccessful in making him a target over Shona, seemingly due to Dino being endearing enough to the likes of Marion and Meryl to where they feel bad about voting him out in this position, which you could certainly credit him with doing solid work here. Though they do end up agreeing to vote for him in this situation where Shona doesn't come back into the game, but as this is going on, we then cut to Dino finding something under a rock, which ends up being a fully powered idol. And here we finally see Dino and Phil have some leverage here and attempt to make a massive move here in using the idol to pull over Palessa, where they can now pull off this massive blindside on Dante, which ends up being a really interesting prospect here that would have been a really fun plurality vote to pull off. But after discussions of this move, we then have Nico arriving at camp, making this a really big fake out, where typically the host doesn't show up at camp unless a player has been pulled from the game, but instead he reveals here that Shona is coming back into the game and that they will have an extra day to scramble. But with Shona back in the game, this does give Dino and Phil an extra number and a shield for the next round, with the fact that now Marion and Meryl have an excuse for not voting for Dino. Unraveling Dante's plan, though we still see him campaign against Dino and does get the vote to be split onto Dino, where he thinks that he has Dino and Phil's vote going for Shona, and he hopes that someone switches their vote to allow him to accidentally take out Dino here. But through Dino and Phil now being involved in the Shona vote, this obviously makes Dino now more aware of how the votes are being split, though he struggles with the concept of using the idol on Shona and now instead wants the votes to land on him, so that he can nullify them with his idol and take Dante out. In order to further spur the votes onto him, he tells Shona to use the fake idol she planted at Tribal to create chaos and get the votes off of her. And this really feels like the perfect way to utilize the fake idol here by ironically taking the votes off of you by using a fake idol and instead making the opposition put their votes on the person that actually has the idol, which would have been an interesting plan to see play out, though for some reason Shona chickens out with this part of the plan, which feels like a massive misstep here, especially because it plays into Phil's eventual decision. And I really don't get like why they wouldn't go through this. Is again, how much leverage would this really give Shona in most other situations? I feel like this was the perfect time to utilize this idol, but again, whatever. Afterwards, we do end up seeing Dino finally talk to Palessa, informing her of the plan to blindside Dante, and we see them formulate the final form of this plan, one that is greatly beneficial to Palessa in having Palessa switch her vote onto Dino, through which that will cause a 3-2-0 vote after Dino's idol play, in which Dante will be blindsided, but does so in a way that allows Palessa to continue playing double agent moving forward, with her being able to claim that her vote for Dino was actually her siding with Dante and doing what he wanted her to do, putting none of the blame onto her, whether Dante goes home or not, while also flushing Dino's idol in a position where had Palessa just voted with them, it would have been enough to take Dante out, but now with him using his idol, this will cause Dino to be more reliant on her, putting Palessa in a really strong position moving forward, though at the same time, I did find her wanting Dante out at this point to still be a questionable move from my point of view, considering how much of a shield he was in the game and how little leverage he had in the game, though him staying ends up being a major reason why she ends up getting taken out. So really, there are a number of pros and cons to this decision, but at this current point, it did seem like a pretty optimal move. But the tribal itself ends up being a really fun one here, where Shona ends up not using her fake idol, spooking Phil coming into the vote, and we get a fantastic vote reveal where everything plays out as expected, where Dino plays his idol, and we get the great reaction from Dante telling the group "I told you so" as he thinks he's going home. And again, as the Dante votes are coming up, it really feels like this is going to be a spectacular blindside, all leading up to the final vote being revealed, where it turns out to be a Shona vote. Strangely being a massive blindside to us, despite it being the obvious result coming into the round. I did like how this really subverted your expectations here, and being one of the few times that Survivor SA truly blindsides you at the time of the vote reveal, which made this tribal particularly notable to me, where again, it isn't revealed until we see the votes during the credits that it turns out that Phil backed out of this plan at the last second due to being sketched out by Shona not going through for a part of the plan, which on paper seems like a really disastrous move here, and the results of it are certainly worse for him than if he did go through with the plan, where losing Shona here obviously loses a number and once again puts him under the mercy of the Breakfast Club. But at the same time, I actually do understand why he backed out of the plan here, where in the world where the other side had been lying to them the entire time, it would have been very likely that both Dino and Shona were or decoy plans, and that they were actually voting first Phil as a safe vote instead, or they could have even just been straight up splitting the vote onto Phil instead of Dino, which either of these scenarios would actually lead to Phil going home. So it does make sense why he is in self-preservation mode here, but through that, it obviously ruins what could have been an all-time great move, though he'll obviously have a lot of time left in the game to make up for that. But with that, let's talk about Shona, who I found to be mostly underwhelming on her run here, with her not demonstrating the amount of potential I thought she could have had coming into the season, where outside of her plot, hide the idol at Tribal, and I guess throwing Sheamus on their bus, which was even a questionable move in itself, I really just don't feel like she had much to do on this season, and her exit from the game here, while a great blindside, did end up being a bit of an underwhelming farewell to her, with her not even being that prominent in her actual boot episode here. So I just found her run as a whole on this season to be largely underwhelming. Then let's jump into episode 9, which the next couple episodes do end up being a bit of a slow point for the season, but even then it's still a solid batch of episodes. Now we do start it with the ramifications of the Shona boot, where Phil recognizes the mistake that he made, and we see that the move has now made Dino public enemy number 1, which all ends up being set up to how much he needs immunity. But also here we do get some fun content from Dante, where he really relishes in the fact that he was right about Dino and ends up declaring himself the Messiah, which was all funny. But also here we do end up seeing him now trusting Plessa even more, despite the fact that Plessa was in on the plan to blindside him, and it almost sending him home. Again, Plessa's move ends up being sold to him as her deciding to work alongside him, and in turn making him trust her even more, which despite her never truly being loyal to Dante here, and her playing this role of double agent, the likes of Marion and Meryl do look at her as someone that is loyal to Dante, and in turn does get her lumped in with him moving forward. But again, coming into the immunity challenge, it is portrayed as a life or death situation for Dino, and the challenge itself here ends up being a really fun one, with it being the blindfold challenge, and Dino end up being the caller here, and ends up winning the challenge for his tribe. Along the way, we do get some really notable moments here. I mean, first up, we get this bizarre moment of Killarney almost passing out on the mat from dehydration, and the medics having to come in to help her, which felt like a really random scene here. But we also get a lot of intermingling between the tribes, where we see Dino tell Teresa that he's going home and tries to get her to throw the challenge, which is funny considering Teresa ends up not being in the best position herself. We also end up seeing Shane leading the tribe into making noises to distract the other tribe, which leads to Teresa being so annoyed to the point where she pushes them, which I thought was funny. We also see Dino telling Tony where to go, making her even more confused. So again, overall, I felt like this was a really fun challenge here that is followed by a reward structured similarly to the ones that we've seen in the past, where the players are allowed to go in one at a time, and obviously advantage is going to be hidden here, and right away we see Meryl find it, being the first to go, and this advantage ends up being the Tribal Council Pass, also known as Safety Without Power in the US, a twist that sends one player at Tribal back to camp, giving them safety, but also no vote in that round, which is an advantage that I for the most part do really like, and it does end up having a fun role on this season. Now afterwards, we do see Meryl tell Marion about this advantage, giving Marion most of the information on where all the advantages end up laying, solidifying the full package once again for the short term, though ironically does end up putting the target on Meryl's back moving forward. But as for Masu, we do end up seeing Pinty returning to the show here, with her getting into an argument with Steffi, to which Steffi apologizes to her, and we finally have Pinty getting upset that she apologized. But either way, the confrontation between the two seems to turn Tajin and Tony away from working with Pinty, and in this position where they are the swing votes for this round, it leads to them not going along with Teresa and Felix's alliance and end up voting out Pinty instead of Killarney here, which again, insane that somehow Steffi avoids being the target throughout all of this, instead further solidifies her bonds with Tony and Tajin, while also building the bond with Killarney, which in turn makes her the best positioned player in the game at this point, with her also having connections on the other tribe as well. Though along the way, we do end up seeing Pinty mention the concept of blindsiding Steffi in a 3-2-2 vote, which would have been a really interesting plurality vote to see, though realistically it wasn't going to happen anyways. They never did have Tony and Tajin voting with them as they thought, but it is moments like this that I do think prop up Pinty a bit to where she's probably not quite the worst Survivor SA player, where she does have decent reads and a competent strategic mind at points, but she's obviously just too volatile and emotional of a figure to actually do much with it. But really at this point, the vote here was pretty straightforward, but along the way we do also get the first mention of of how big of a goat Killarney is, where Teresa justifies her targeting her because she wants to be the goat that's dragged to the end instead of Killarney, which is an interesting strategy here, but I do think is one that Teresa seemed a bit too tunnel visioned on, as that's not really the perception she seemed to have on this season of being this GOAT. So I don't even think this would have been that effective of a plan if she had been able to go through with it, but the vote itself does end up being pretty fun, where we do finally see Pinty getting voted out here, blindsiding Felix and Teresa in the process, but in her exit, we see Pinty being upset at Tony, but also Felix, and asks Felix if he's the one to blindside her, which was a funny moment to me. But with that, let's talk about Pinty, who certainly had an interesting run this return here, where despite her seeming to essentially be the exact same player as last time, she obviously makes a deeper run here, though at the same time still shows the same flaws that she had last time. But I do think again that she has a decent strategic mind, with her being a part of the Tevin and Sheamus blindsides, and following that up with this pretty intricate plan of blindsiding Steffi. But everything else about her as a survival player is just terrible, to where despite her being this clear GOAT on the board, Tony and Tajin still decide to vote her out for what seems like our personal reasons. Not even just her being a number for Felix and Teresa, to which they end up blindsiding them just to take out Pinty here, which to me is a massive indictment on her game, to where even though she had no chance at winning the game, her personality rubs people off to the point where they don't even want to bring her far into the game. So again, I think as a whole, obviously Pinty is a deeply flawed player here. But now let's jump into episode 10, which ends up being a pretty by-the-numbers episode, but still has some interesting moments within it. But right away, you do get the sense that one of Felix or Teresa are going home here, with Felix's edit starting to pick up a bit with him being propped up as an underdog figure on this tribe. But afterwards, we do end up seeing Tajin finally find the idol he was meant to find 3 episodes ago, and we do see him and Tony come up with an interesting plan here in a way to use the idol, where again, the idol does have to be given away by the end of this round, and here we see them decide to hand it off to Dino, where Tony eventually does so after the challenge in a bit of an obvious way, but through this obviously gives Dino an idol to use up until the merge, giving him a lot of leverage moving forward, and does seem to further pull Plessa back onto his side, with her now wanting to work with him in order to get in the good graces of Tony. But also, the episode ends up being a massive dunking on Shane, which really comes out of left field after him being mostly quiet in the edit since the first couple episodes. But here, we end up seeing him trying to be this double agent, leaking information to Dino and Phil, only for them to not believe a second of it and mocking him in the confessional, and also proceeding to talk about blindsiding him with the idol, which this obviously doesn't end up happening, but the level of negativity for Shane here really just exposes the smarminess that he exudes that I always assumed would have led to him not being trusted by a decent amount of players, but here to see it actually come to be does show him to be really ineffective here, though through this we do get a really funny scene of Shane telling them that he has pull with Tajin and what's her name, meaning Steffi, which felt like a very Brian Heidick moment there. But as for Masu, obviously they do end up losing the challenge, where we do get this debate over if they should vote for Felix or Teresa, though we do end up getting talk about the worry of Dante possibly giving his idol to Felix, which makes you wonder why he didn't consider that after finding out that Tajin didn't have the idol, though again, to be fair, Dante does use the fake idol effectively, which we will talk about. But through this worry and Teresa obviously being looked at as the physically weakest of the two, the target does end up landing back on Teresa, which I guess this is where I should mention the fact that I don't get why Tony and Tajin are even going for either of them here, which is a concept you can debate in the last round as well. But again, keeping Steffi in the game here just seems to be so dangerous for them, really empowering the opposition on the other tribe. And even if you don't want to get rid of Steffi, keeping Killarney here empowers Steffi, while Teresa and Felix here are allies of Dino and Phil, the people that they plan on working with after the merge. So I do feel like them not targeting Steffi, or at least Killarney here, does feel like a massive misstep to me. And again, all credit to Steffi for getting in this position where they don't want to take her out, and her bonding with Tony to the point where she seems to want to keep her safe. And we even see like Tony tell her about Tajin's idol, showing how much Tony really is snowed snowed by Steffi here into thinking that she's actually on her side, which again, despite Tony and Tajin having control of this tribe at this point in the game, I do feel like they completely mismanaged that control, getting themselves into a merge position where they are inherently on the bottom. But here we do see Teresa doing some pretty effective campaigning to Tajin, where she does make herself out to be a potential ally for him moving forward, especially more so than Killarney. And with the worry of Killarney being such a clear goat to where she's going to be dragged to the final two, Tajin does waver here and does talk about the potential of causing a 3-2-1 by flipping over to Teresa and Felix, which, while a chaotic move that would lose some trust with Tony, I still feel like this might have been a move worth making. But really, it all comes down to the fact that they shouldn't have trusted Steffi as much as they did, as it just ends up putting them in a bad position moving forward, and one that, again, very much should have been foreshown to them. But before Tribal, we do have this dilemma for Teresa over whether or not to hope for Tajin siding with them, or to go into full self-preservation mode by voting for Felix, which could have saved her under this circumstance that we end up seeing of Tajin not siding with them. But I did find the fact that Teresa ends up talking about feeling bad to write down Felix's name that eventually leads to her getting voted out here does end up being an interesting arc for her, with it showcasing her development as a player here, where last time she played, she comes off as this really robotic figure that didn't build personal bonds, and now she builds such strong personal bonds to the point where she feels bad going against them. And that leads to her eventual vote out here, where obviously it turns out that Tajin did not go through the plan, and through Felix not voting against her either, we also get a 2-2 tie, where Teresa is voted out on the revote. And for Teresa here, again, I do think she improved upon her game from the first time around. Where last time, she was just so much in her own head about playing the game strategically and thinking about people as chess pieces, to where she completely failed at every opportunity she had, with her not having any social bonds or any pull in order to execute any of her ideas. But here, she did make some moves and was in the majority alliance for a while, and obviously she didn't have a great swap section of her game here, but she still seemed to have Tajin in her corner, and he talks about wanting to keep her, if not for the worry of the ramifications that doing so would have on his game. So again, I do feel like she greatly improved her social game here, and also has a decent enough strategic mind, again, still very messy one, but still demonstrating enough potential here to where if she were to play again, I could definitely see a decent run in her. Now let's jump into episode 11, the next of the non-elimination episodes, with us nearing the merge and using a mergatory-esque twist here to lead our way into it, with this certainly being better than the hourglass twist from Survivors 41 and 42, but I will still say that I don't love how this round is formatted. Now, before the reveal of the twist, we do get some content back at Masu with Tony and Tajin now talking about taking out Killarney over Felix, which, again, why now? Why not do it before you pissed off Felix by voting out all of his allies, and he's now in a position where he can reconnect with Dino, Phil, and Dante after the merge, who are all better options for him moving forward than them. I felt like that was ridiculous. On Yantao, we do get some content revolving around Dante and Meryl, with Meryl being upset at Dante for really trying to strong-arm people into targeting Dino, furthering the split between the two. But also here we do actually get to what is probably Dante's best individual move of the season in revealing the idol that he got from the Outpost to the other players, but pretending like it is a fully powered idol, which through doing so, he essentially gives himself implicit immunity in a position where he was clearly one of the bigger targets on the board coming into this next round. So this was surprisingly very good use of a expired idol here, but eventually we do get to the immunity challenge, where we do learn about the twist for this round, where we are going to get a travel immunity challenge here, but each player will be playing as individuals, and the individual winner will win immunity for their entire tribe in a tribal where both tribes go to tribal and vote someone out together. Again, essentially the hourglass fish from Survivor 41 and 42, but without the hourglass where we are reversing the results of the challenge, but also a major difference here, one that makes it so I don't personally look at this as the true merge round, unlike the hourglass rounds of 41 and 42, is the fact that the tribes are still tribes. They are still spending time separated at their individual camps to where they can't coordinate until tribal, which to me is such a major change here that makes it more in line with the joint tribal twist from Game Changers than a typical merge round. But beyond that, we do also get another addition to this challenge, that does incentivize players to outlast your other tribe members, where the last person standing for each tribe gets to visit the outpost together, which ends up being a great excuse to once again create another cross-tribal relationship and allow these players to discuss the plan for the upcoming vote. As for the actual events of the challenge, we do end up seeing Yontal kind of suck here, and it really comes down to Dino and Phil pretty quickly, where we do interestingly see Dino throw the comp, with Dino already having an idol that assumably expires after this round, and Phil being pretty defenseless here. So through sending him to the outpost, it ends up essentially handing him implicit immunity as well, with the assumption that the outpost will give him some sort of advantage. So this worry of him having something does stir the votes away from him as well. Also during the challenge, we do see Felix drop right away, leading to Dante dropping out as well so that he can talk to him on the bench, which felt like such a blatant display of their relationship that really just shows how unsubtle Dante is in his gameplay here. Now also here we do see Marion use her diplomatic immunity to swap over to Masu, which essentially gives her immunity for this round, and she uses it in what would be assumed to be the final opportunity to do so, which does make this the optimal move here, though I will say that if I was in the game, I would be worried about the possible chance of production messing with us and there actually being another round before the actual merge, though either way, I do think you can assume that the merge is coming up, to where I feel like you probably should still play it here, especially considering the really limited number of players eligible to even go home for this next round. Now, before the actual outpost visit, we do get some of the scramble back at camp, though through her swapping to Masu, we do end up seeing her getting a bit of a frosty reception while there, with even Steffi being annoyed that she came over, with her saying she's worried Marion's going to mess up her game, which is a storyline that really goes nowhere considering her and Marion do end up working in lockstep until her eventual boot. This did actually make me think at the time that Steffi was probably willing to flip against Marion moving forward and could potentially work with Tony, obviously way more so than she actually ends up being. Now in Yontal, we do really get to see how limited this vote ends up being here, where out of the 7 that were initially on this tribe, Marion obviously had diplomatic immunity, so now she is safe. Dino has an idol everyone knows about, so he is safe. They think Dante has an idol, so he is implicitly safe. They assume Phil will get something from the outpost, so he's implicitly safe. So through that only leaves 3 people even thought of as a possible person to vote for here, and considering Shane ends up claiming to have an idol and Meryl actually has the tribal council pass, it really makes this an extremely convoluted vote to really only Palessa, where Palessa ends up being the only person here without anything at all to protect herself. And by the end of this episode, we do see Meryl already talking about targeting Palessa, ironically due to her relationship with Dante, and Dante himself presumed to not be eligible here, which again has this double agent role she was trying to play backfire on her here, but in a way that I do think she still gets unlucky in how this twist plays out, with how few options there were, and how the two sides weren't given more time to communicate, and how her double agent role also made her expendable to pretty much everybody, as while she had a working relationship with everyone, she also wasn't the number one ally for anyone at this point, to where she just ends up being in this expendable position where if a safe vote is needed, she's just such an easy option to use here. And while she would have been safe in any standard round of gameplay, the perfect storm of unfortunate events end up occurring for Palessa here to make her an easy target on the board. But the episode does end with a visit to the outpost, where Phil goes alongside Tony, where when there we find out that they are going to have to predict who will be voted out, and if they are successful in voting that person out, they will get a shared idol, which again, I do actually really like this twist, where it does a couple things here, obviously forcing these two players from opposite tribes to work together and allowing them to strategize for the upcoming vote, but also beyond that introduces the element of a bounty to the game of Survivor, which is a concept we have seen before in something like Sequester, but I did like seeing it translate here, and did have an interesting effect on the vote, with them now being more incentivized to make sure this plan goes through, even though they fail at that. Though the plan that we do see them come up with is to target Shane, with the intended plan of splitting the votes on Shane and Meryl, with them fully plotting out who will vote for who. And this did seem like a solid plan, though obviously they don't end up having all the numbers that they thought that they had. But again, through this, you would think that Shane will be the big target coming into the actual vote. But the final scene of the episode here ends up being fantastic, where we cut back to camp, where we see Shane finding an advantage, being such a perfect way to end this episode. episode, increasing the tension on if the Shane plan was going to go through. But this leads us to episode 12, where most of the tension is gone almost right away, where we do find out that it isn't an idol that Shane has found, but instead Yantao's version of diplomatic immunity, which again has already become void due to the rule of only having one player being able to use it, which made that cliffhanger really underwhelming, though Shane does end up using it to fake that he has an idol, which no one seemed to truly believe, and finally it seemed like part of the reason they don't believe it is because they believed that Dante had an idol, who again was also lying about having an idol. And again, all this is just ridiculous to have all these people lying about having fake idols. But eventually we do get to Phil and Tony returning from their outpost trip, where they do lie about the bounty and instead talk about being given an extra vote against somebody, which further complicates this vote, with most people assuming that they have the potential of putting an extra vote on somebody. But really, as a part 2 to the previous episode, we obviously do just get more of the same storylines coming into Tribal, where Meryl continues to target Palessa because of her connection to Dante, which Dino and Phil seem to jump on board with after learning that Dante is planning on still voting for Phil, despite the worry of him having an advantage, making Phil turn to self-preservation mode, especially once no one on Yantao seems to be on board with the Shane plan, which made the Palessa plan seem like an even more obvious one that was going to go through here. Though through this we do start to get talk about how big of a threat Meryl is, which ends up being her perception moving forward, where she gets called out for being this triple threat in the game, so much to the point where I do feel like the moves being made against her moving forward were not the optimal moves for the players making them. But here we do get some talk from Dino about getting Tony and Tajin to switch the vote to Meryl, but again, at the end of the day, they do still end up going with the safer route here. On the Masu side of things, we do see that no one believes Tony's side of the story, with even Killarney pointing out how obvious it is that she's lying, which should really tell you something. But again, here as well, the Shane plan gets turned down, with Steffi instantly being against it, and at this point, it becomes extremely clear that Steffi's loyalty lands with the Breakfast Club, where she talks about using Tony. And this episode really just further solidifies how strong of a position Steffi seemed to be in, with her formally making a final 2 of Killarney, her talking about having Felix in her pocket, and her still having those connections to the Breakfast Club, plus her newfound relationship with Tony. That puts her in a masterful position at this point in the game, but here she ends up informing Killarney and Felix of where she actually stands, and ends up having them vote alongside the Breakfast Club in this round, which we do have Miriam bringing over information from the other side to further the word of the Palessa plan here, which ends up being another boon to the use of diplomatic immunity in this particular round. So coming into the Tribal, it did feel like Palessa was the obvious boot, but we still get a really fun Tribal despite that, where the two groups are interacting for the first time, and while at first we do see some whispering here and there, eventually Nico just lets everyone get up and talk, which I'm kind of conflicted on, where I do feel like for this Tribal in particular, it would have been a lot more interesting to see if they couldn't talk to each other, as because they were able to do so, it just leads to the Palessa vote becoming even more known by the entire tribe, to the point where it ends up being a near unanimous vote by the end of it. It was funny to see Tajin finding out about this plan, which he openly talks about how confused he is right before they end up voting, where he talks about being confused over why they would be turning on one of their own, and talks about what happened to the game plan, which really just makes Tajin look aloof in this position, especially because outside of voicing his confusion, he doesn't do anything to actually change the plan here, outside of just mentioning how stupid it is. And something that I am particularly confused about here is what happened to Dino's idol. What is assumedly the last time to use it, and Dino doesn't even end up using it on himself here. Now again, I suspect that was probably because obviously they don't know for sure that this is the last Tribal before the merge. But the fact that Dino's idol was never part of the discussion to blindside Meryl here did seem like a bit of a missed opportunity. As for the likes of Tony and Tajin, letting go of Palessa here really sets them up for failure coming into the next round, with Tony in particular seeming like such an easy target off the bat. But again, funnily no advantages end up being played here despite how much talk about them factored into the vote here. And we do get this fun moment of Dante revealing that his idol was expired the entire time, and then Shane proceeding to follow that up with saying that his was just a stone as well. But the vote ends up being a massive Palessa landslide here, taking her out in a bit of a whimper. But following this, we do end the episode with Nico revealing that they are now merged, which was a nice moment to have at Tribal here, especially considering how important the event of the merge plays into this pre-merge versus post-merge theme, and to see everyone get to celebrate that at Tribal here was a nice moment for the cast. Well, then let's talk about the boot in Palessa, who had a strong enough run on this season. I mean, while it wasn't a particularly notable one in comparison to her Philippines run, I do still think she played better on this season despite her being on the outs at points. And I do feel like she was really unlucky in how this round played out and how everyone was just able to fake having some sort of advantage that led to her being taken out as this really expendable piece on the board. But really, the season doesn't change my overall opinion on Palessa's legacy, where she really demonstrated the same amount of game ability as she did the first time around and is still a really iconic figure in the history of the series. So for me, she comes out of this pretty unscathed. But I'll show them in episode 13, the start of the merge, which does give us a mostly predictable result, playing off the back of the previous Palessa vote, but is still a solid episode despite that. That episode does start with the reveal that there isn't going to be a merge feast, but instead we get a reward challenge to divvy out who gets what item. A format taken from Australian Survivor Brains vs. Brawn, and it was a fun change to the format there, and I think it plays out similarly here, where the items range from food to advantages, and it ends up providing some fun moments here, with us right away seeing Steffi going for a covered item and ends up getting a bowl of rice, to which we see her devastated reaction as almost everyone else that comes after her ends up getting a full-blown meal. But interestingly, we do end up seeing some players helping out others, with Shane instantly staying in to help out Marion. Dante goes in to help in Meryl, and we see no one helping Tony until Dino comes in, seeming to be his sympathy move there. But again, this just really further shows you Tony being on the bottom of the tribe here, but also along the way we do end up seeing advantages being divvied out, with Meryl getting the Outsurance token, which is essentially just a reward steal without the steal part of it. But again, not really anything game changing. We do also see Dino get the save the date advantage, which is essentially a modification of the legacy advantage, with it not having any power until day 32. But on that day, the player holding it will be sent to the outpost, which did lead to an interesting mystery of what's going to happen on day 32. But overall, the advantage itself didn't really play any factor until that point. But also here we see Phil end up getting a reward for the entire tribe in spices and ice cold drinks. So at least the entire tribe got something. Now the immunity challenge obviously occurs later in the episode than the last few, but here we do get a fun character moment from Phil with him peeing in the middle of the challenge to where the wind blows it towards the other players, so that's obviously disgusting but funny at the same time. And surprisingly, Phil ends up winning the challenge as well, which was a more traditional endurance challenge here that, again, you wouldn't expect Phil to beat out the likes of Dante and Steffi. And really across the season, he does surprisingly well in challenges here. But as for the gameplay of the round, we do initially get a lot of focus around the Felix and Dante relationship, with them being called out for being a strong duo here. To which we do even hear from Dante that he wants to go to Final 2 with Felix. And considering Felix ends up being the only person not in the know for when Dante ends up going home, this essentially makes Felix Dante's only true ally here. But as for this actual round, the Breakfast Club does end up sticking together here, with the obvious target being Tony, which through doing so makes Dante feel more solidified with the group, as they're finally doing a move that he wants them to do. But again, it still leaves him clearly on the outs of this group. But as for Felix, he does end up having other options here, particularly the No BS Alliance that we do see come back together here, and while initially on the outs at the beginning of the merge, they do end up enacting a pretty impressive coup in a few rounds time, but here they do have to play along with the majority, with Tony still being completely snowed by Steffi in a position where the likes of Phil and Dino do try to warn her of Steffi's true affiliation, but she doesn't end up believing them, leading to Steffi acting as the swing in this round, but is a swing that is so clearly going to side with the Breakfast Club that again there's no real suspense here. But through No BS knowing that Steffi is lying to Tony the entire time, they do end up being additional votes for the majority to end up splitting the vote here, used to put their votes onto Tajin in a round where conveniently Tajin ends up finding an idol right before Tribal. And in another wasted opportunity, where with this idol, Tajin could have tried to secure No BS on his side and pull off a power move here, but instead he just passively plays the idol for himself after keeping it a secret, in a position where all he does is nullify those 3 votes that were split onto him, and Tony still ends up going home. Though I will say that for the likes of Steffi, I do find this to be a bit of a misstep for her to let Tony go in this position, as she had Tony completely in her corner at this point over Tajin, to where Steffi mentions that Tajin is the issue. So you would think that she would have tried to sway the vote away from Tony, Though realistically, with both Dante and Marion being so gung-ho about taking Tony out at this point, it would have been difficult to pull off without wasting so much social capital there, so the Tony boot ends up being a pretty mundane affair here. And Tony had an interesting arc on the return here, where she essentially ends up being the exact same player as last time, but due to the amount of connections she had coming into the season, it did land her in a position where it felt like she always had options in the game, but I feel like she really mismanaged most of the decisions that she ended up having to make here when she was in power. Now, a lot of that seems to stem from the fact that she really thought Steffi was on her side while she never was. She simply just didn't have the numbers. But really, Tony's another player that her legacy for me is mostly intact. I feel like the level of gameplay that she demonstrated here is still on par with her in the last season, and this season doesn't really do much to change my opinion of that. Now for episode 14, which ends up being another mostly predictable episode, but one that feels like the calm before the storm, that really sets up a really strong following 2 episodes. Now we do start the episode with Tajin being blindsided by the Tony boat, and this starts a really weird trajectory in the edit for Tajin here, where despite him coming into the season being known as a savvy strategic player, he does come off as more of a doofus across this season, with a lot of that seeming to stem from the fact that Tajin seemed to be struggling with the conditions, with everyone talking about how much he's struggling without any food, and through that, seemed to lost the energy he had for the game here. But really, this entire episode ends up being the downfall of Dante, where right away we do see Shane, Marion, and Meryl talk about needing to get rid of Dante, with Dante being too close to Felix, and also on Tony's way out, she did end up saying that she would have given her vote to Dante. And Meryl seems to be the most gung-ho about this plan, talking about everyone associating them together and her being the subject of split votes because of him. And while I do think there is merit to this plan, I do think the entire targeting of Dante seemed to be really misguided from my point of view. From Meryl's perspective, while eyes are on her and Dante as a duo, most of the people who do look at them as a duo are either gone or on their way out, to where Dante and Felix are looked at as more of a duo at this point by the people in the core majority, where I do feel like for Meryl, Dante could have been this secret weapon for her, and at worst, a shield for her moving forward, where immediately after Dante ends up going here, we do see the target shift onto Meryl. So I do feel like it benefited her game to keep Dante in the game, but even from a more general Breakfast Club standpoint, I do feel like this move here was also a major misstep in it opening up the game for the very next round, where through them losing a number here, it opens up this opportunity for a No BS alliance, where for me, again, 100% the target here should have been Felix. I mean, here you weaken Dante by taking out Felix, keeping him both as a shield and a number who has no other options at this point, and also weaken Dino moving forward. So to me, I just feel like this was a move, and one of many moves on this season, I feel like was made like one round too early. That makes it a suboptimal move for the people that are actually doing it. And along the way, we do end up seeing Dante going back to being tunnel visioned on taking Dino out, with him pissing off even more people along the way, and we have this really awkward interaction with him and Tajin, with him being super forceful with him, to the point where Shane, of all people, talks about how this goes against the way that he plays the game, and that Dante's now bullying Tajin, and this was just a really terrible look for Dante here, but it was interesting to see Shane here also talk about feeling bad for voting out Dante, especially considering he had voted for him in the very first round of the game. But this does start this interesting storyline for Shane, where he talks multiple times across this season about making friends, but needing to make the move that was the best for his game, and really seeming to be one of the players on the season getting the most content about doing what needs to be done to win the game, and being one of the most laser-focused people on winning the actual prize here. But also here we do end up seeing Shane tell Tajin that the vote is actually on Dante, which Tajin doesn't believe because of Shane's reputation from the Chappies vote, which I do think shows you the level of respect people had for Shane here, where it did seem to stem from that rocky start that lowered people's opinions on Shane. But another major storyline of this episode is how big of a threat Meryl is becoming, which really just ends up setting up the major events in the following episodes, where first up, she does end up winning immunity here, and along with that comes a reward, where she picks those who didn't get food in the previous round to go along with her, but once they get there, they find out that they have a dilemma of eating or getting blankets for the entire tribe, which they do end up having to give up the food here. But also a part of this is the fact that they have to give out fortune cookies to the entire tribe, with one of them sending a player to the outpost, which just so happens to be Meryl, increasing her target even more here, where she ends up getting the chance of giving up her vote in this round to get a 50-50 coin. Obviously a 50% chance of having an idol, which she obviously ends up taking as the votes for this round are already clearly on Dante at this point, and her vote isn't necessary here. And also having the no vote makes her look a bit less sketchy when returning to camp, and her being able to claim that she lost the game instead of actually winning it. But through all of these things happening in this episode, she really ends up being looked at as the most powerful player in the game, with most of the power players knowing for sure that she at least has the Tribal Council pass. Now they assume that she gets another power from the Outpost, and she's already looked at as a massive social and physical threat as well. So Meryl's threat level at this point really goes over the roof, to the point where I feel like the players were too tunnel vision on this and ended up making suboptimal moves because of that. With Marion really leading the charge here and setting up the Meryl boot for the next round, where we do see the relationship with Phil coming back to the story, where she plots with him to make this move, which he seemed fully on board with, which ends up being a nice subverting of expectations once again here coming into the next episode. But again, the vote on Dante was pretty apparent, though we do get a lot of content from Dino talking about being paranoid over him actually being the target, which felt like a lot of wasted time. But at Tribal, we do also strangely get a fight between Tajin and Steffi over her blindsiding Tony, and we also get to see Dino scrambling even more at Tribal to try to get people to vote for Dino, which is funny considering he's doing this under the assumption that he's not even in danger. But when the votes do come out, we do see him get up before the final vote is read, which continues this trend of really fun exits here. And Dante to me was one of the bigger surprises on this season, where coming into the season, Dante was one of the casting choices I was the most disappointed by, especially when there were so many other people that I would have rather seen back personally. But I did feel like Dante played such a massive role on this season. I found his presence here to be really fun, with him being so tunnel vision in the game, and considering all of his constant failures to get Dino out, it really just made him fun to watch. I did also appreciate how much more aggressively he was playing the game in this season, where while he ends up placing the exact same as he did last time, I do feel like he played a bit better here. Now, not by much, but I do feel like he had some impressive work at points, particularly in the first few rounds, and his fake idol play that saved him at the placebo. So again, there was strong gameplay here and there, to where I do feel like his casting here was overall a net positive. Now let's jump to episode 15, which ends up being one of the best episodes of the season, providing another fantastic downfall, but one that wasn't as foreshown as the last couple, which had been really set up for episodes before they end up happening, when this one comes up relatively late for SA standards. So obviously this episode does all lead up to the Steffi blindside, but funnily the first person to mention it here ends up being Killarney, this person portrayed as someone blindly loyal to Steffi, and also someone who doesn't end up being involved in the blindside itself. But we see her end up approaching Shane and telling him that they need to take out Steffi as the biggest threat in the game, to which he promptly turns her down, telling her that Meryl is the target instead. But her just randomly bringing this up gives Killarney the misconception that the entire plot was her idea, which leads to some funny content moving forward. But the fact that even Killarney could call out that Steffi was the biggest threat in the game here does show you how Steffi was perceived while out there, to where I assume most people knew how big of a threat she was, and through that her masterful position ends up starting to crumble here. Now afterwards, we do get to the immunity challenge really early into the episode. We do get a uniquely structured one here, where we have an endurance comp to start it. That narrows the field down to 6, but we still see the endurance comp play out in full, with the winner getting an advantage in part 2, which ended up being a series of table mazes. And I'll be honest, like really a lot of this felt like a lot of wasted time, just filler to prolong the challenge. But this ends up being a pretty big challenge here, as the reward with this challenge is a car, which we end up seeing Dino win both parts of the challenge, with Tajin actually having a lead for most of part 2, leaving him devastated when he barely loses out there, and we end up seeing him beg to Dino, getting on his knees for him to take him to the reward, only for Dino to still pick those that had to give up their food for blankets, which was probably the optimal move here, though through that does lead to more negative content for Tajin, with Marion calling him entitled. Now I will say something that did come to my mind through all of this is that I assume that Meryl wasn't allowed to use the outsurance coin for this, as that would have been hilarious if she didn't also got a free car. But again, I assume that wasn't allowed. But also interestingly here, we do end up hearing that those that don't go on the reward will have a rock draw to decide who goes to the Outpost, which we do end up seeing Marion getting chosen here, which then she is given the dilemma of getting a bag of rice for the entire tribe or getting a clue to the idol. And she's extremely emotional over this decision, but does end up taking the rice. Really, either choice has its pros and cons to where I don't think there is a solid decision on which one is better for her in particular here, especially considering her assumed position at the top of the pecking order. But through taking the rice, she does end up talking about potentially regretting that decision and gets really emotional back at camp, where Meryl ends up consoling her, only for Meryl to then leave, and instantly Marion ends up campaigning against her to Phil, which was a ridiculous series of events there. Now we do also get another weird series of events from the players not on reward making a bowl of rice, despite Felix and Marion not agreeing with it, and when they do, Tajin also decides to not eat any rice, and through that ends up annoying the other players, particularly Killarney. And really this entire situation makes him come off as pretty spineless here, not having a mind of his own, while further ruining the reputation that he has with the other players. And what's even funnier is that he ends up stealing rice from the camp anyway, which all of this just felt like another dodo moment for him. But through this, we do get a strange confessional from him where he talks about thinking that Killarney was a loyal goat, but now seeing a different side of her, and talks about her transformation, which was such a bizarre confessional here that actually for a second did make me think, is Killarney a potential WTF winner at this point? Though obviously that was brought back down through all the negative content she gets moving forward. But beyond this, again, I feel like a lot of the early episode does revolve around Meryl being the target for the likes of Marion, Steffi, and Shane. And through that, Phil and Dino are initially on board with the plan, and we do see Marion trying to pull in Felix in the plan as well. And for me, the targeting of Meryl from Marion and Steffi here ends up being another move that I just feel like was made one round too early. Where the Dante move alone was bad, but combining that with the plan to take out Meryl here really just opens up the game for the No BS Alliance, where now all they have to do is pick up the outsiders in Tajin and Meryl and pull off a 5-4 blindside to take out a core member of the Breakfast Club Alliance. And we see them put this plot together here and execute it pretty flawlessly. But the shocking thing to me is the fact that this plan comes together by Felix, who had been playing better than his last time around up to this point, but I really didn't think he had it in him to execute such a great move here. Where first we do hear from Steffi talking about trusting Felix as he plays with honor and how he's not a threat, only to cut to Felix approaching Phil and telling him that Steffi is the one running the game, not Meryl, and calling out all of her one-on-one bonds, and we see him get Dino on board as well. We later see him talk to Meryl and get her on board with the plan. And really, I just can't believe this came from Felix, who had been the least prominent figure of the No BS Alliance, and someone that everyone seemed to underestimate while out there. And this one move here perfectly sets up the No BS Alliance to really just run the entire game, with them being a 3 in a final 5 alliance at the point of the final 8, in a position where Meryl had no other options and Tajin had very few options. While also this all fractures the former majority alliance to where they're unlikely to regroup, so this should have been a game-winning move for one of the 3 of them in itself and should have led to a more straightforward endgame, but thankfully we do get some missteps that causes some fractures moving forward that make the game moving forward more interesting and leaving it really dynamic. But this vote off really felt like the climax of the season, the big move that really dictates how the endgame is going to play out, taking out the biggest threat on the board with an idol in her pocket and completely fracturing the former majority alliance along the way. Though I will say that while all this lead up was fantastic to watch, I did find the tribal itself to be mostly mundane, but the blindside was still really fun, with once again Steffi piecing together that she's going home once the votes come up for her, and being the next in this series of really fun exits, with her also being prepared for her vote out by the time the final vote comes out. But with that, let's talk about Steffi, who is clearly up there with the most improved players, despite the fact that she placed lower than she did her first time around. She really came out for last season seeming like a mostly emotional player, and while she did demonstrate a killer instinct to a degree in her wanting to take out Rob by the end of it, she really had no chance of winning the game with her not being respected by her cast. But on this season, while there were elements of her still being an emotional figure, I do feel like she improved her social game to a degree that I really didn't think she had in her. So again, she was positioned in a masterful way coming into the merge. Now again, I still have nitpicks with some strategic decisions she made in the last few rounds, but she did play a much better game on this season, and one that I was impressed to see her pull off, and did find her overall boot here to be one of the bigger moments of the season as well. But now for episode 16, which ends up being another of the best episodes of the season, with this episode finally now providing what should have been the obvious Meryl boot from the previous episode, but in a situation that ends up coming as a massive blindside for Meryl, instead of the foreshown situation that it would have been had it happened in the previous round. Now the episode does start with Marion being upset by the Steffi boot, where she does think that she's the next to go, which would have made a lot of sense, but never seemed to be an actual reality here, but never seemed to be an actual possibility here due to her relationships with Phil and Dino. But along the way, we do also see her now fully rat out Meryl, telling the No BS Alliance about her advantages, which does seem to effectively put a bigger target on Meryl's back, which that is good work, but I will say I don't love how Marion treats Meryl across this episode, where she completely ignores her and seems to hold a lot of animosity towards Meryl when Meryl is the victim in this situation. I mean, Marion is the one to flip against Meryl, so to have Marion be the one upset in this situation just seemed really ridiculous, especially with Meryl vocalizing about how alone she feels now, having lost all of her long-term relationships and having to start anew. But to start all that off, we do see Meryl giving Tajan her outsurance token, which she did promise him at the end of the last episode if he voted her way. I'm sure he would have flipped anyway, but it is funny to think about the scenario where Tajan only made the move that was in his own best interest because of the promise of a future reward. But through all this, we do end up seeing Meryl and Tajan seem to solidify their alliance, thinking they're now in the majority along with the No BS Alliance, which ends up being kind of humorous considering they're literally the next two boots on the board. But Meryl does put all of her eggs into the No BS Alliance here, which makes it even more questionable to me that they are so willing to blindside her. And funnily, it is Felix once again getting credit on the show for initiating the Meryl blindside, and while an impressive move to take out Meryl with her having multiple advantages, I do feel like this was still a massive misstep for the No BS Alliance in a similar way to how the Dante move was bad for the Breakfast Club. Now I will say that Meryl certainly had more win equity than Dante, especially considering we're further into the game and in a position where she does have a lot of advantages, most of which expire at 6, so again I get why they're worried about her being able to use her advantages to get to the final 5 unscathed, but considering her later use of an advantage and her further showing trust to this group, I just feel like this was a move that just opened up the game once again for them losing their numbers moving forward, where they become a 3 out of 7 in a position where they leave Tajan out of the vote, so like just naturally you would think they'll be outnumbered. Though obviously the dynamics after this round don't end up being as clear as what they seemed, but it still felt like the No BS Alliance opened up the game with this vote in a way that felt completely unnecessary. But I find this to be the bigger misstep for Felix in particular, who is the one orchestrating this move in a position where he is getting rid of Meryl, a clear number for him, in a position where he is one of the people on the outskirts of the new dynamics after this vote, with both Dino and Phil having connections to Marion that Felix simply doesn't have. And I suspect that the new Final Four alliance that forms the next episode was already in existence at this point in the game, to where I feel like this vote really just sets Felix up to be the obvious boot for the next round, even though the actual execution of this individual vote is still pretty impressive. Now beyond this, we do get to see Marion and Dino further bond over their love of the game, and we get this discussion over them wanting the winner to be someone that is an ambassador of the game, which I guess some people were upset over about them talking about this under the context of them being the only ones that deserve the title, which is not the vibe that I got from this. It really just feels like they were able to bond over how massive of fans that they were and how they have similar philosophies in the game, where they want the season to be represented by a player that respects and plays the game in the way that they do, which is the way that most people approach a jury vote. I mean, I know people looked at this as a counter to what happened with Nicole in the previous season, but really I feel like it goes even beyond that in SA, where straight up most SA winners are not that good. And to be fair, part of that is consequence of having a final 2, which opens up the possibility of 2 of the bigger goats on the board reaching the final 2 together, which has happened in both SA6 and SA8 to the most recent seasons on the board. So again, to play as a counter to that and not wanting to be in a situation where you're forced to vote between the two people you perceive to have played the worst games shouldn't be that controversial of an opinion to me. Though I will say it did bring a strange dynamic to this endgame, with the perceived bigger threats in Dino and Marion end up teaming up here alongside the other bigger threats, which is not how you would expect this endgame to naturally play out. But I did love how following this scene, we do see Shane and Marion talk, with Shane being confused over why Marion is trusting Dino, and then proceeds to say that her so quickly working with the enemy makes him worried that she has changed as a player, which overall, the entire view that Shane has on Marion, it seems to be kind of ridiculous to me, where he holds her in such a high pedestal, which makes the gravitas of this statement feel even more ridiculous. But he also ends up scolding his other Alliance members, talking about Tajin going insane from his lack of food, which this episode further dunks on Tajin, with him being called an unreliable Alliance member. And then he calls Killarney ridiculous, as this is the first instance of this really funny storyline where we find out that Killarney thinks that she's actually the mastermind, where she thinks that her briefly mentioning the concept of taking out Steffi to Shane is what led to the Steffi boot actually happening. And the same thing happens with this round as well, where she talks to Dino about taking out Meryl, and later hears about the Meryl boot and thinks that she must have been the mastermind behind all of it, which really just shows her delusions in the game here, and it's really funny to see the other players mock her in confessional over it. But this ends up being a big episode for Marion, where she continues her upward trajectory with her winning immunity, and afterwards it's pretty clear that Meryl was going home, but she really gets a spectacular exit from the game, which starts with her talking about wanting to use her advantages not just for herself, but to propel her alliance, showing trust in a no BS alliance by talking about not using her tribal council pass on herself, but instead using it on Marion to give the opposition one less vote, and in turn allowing her alliance to split the vote. During which we see Phil and Dino get excited over this plan, as they are now able to blindside her with her misplaying her advantage. But to me, again, I feel like the fact that Meryl plays her pass here, one, does show trust with her alliance, and also gets rid of the pass, significantly lowering the threat level of Meryl, to where I feel like at this point, I would have kept her in the game, where you have her as a shield and a loyal number moving forward. But considering Dino and Phil's side alliance with Shane and Marion that we later find out about, I guess it does make sense for why they don't go with that route, but I still feel like that isn't the route that I personally would have taken. But Meryl misplaying her advantage here is a move that is propped up as an all-time dumb move, which I don't fully subscribe to that opinion. It's where, again, in comparison to something like the Eric Reichenbach move, where Eric had guaranteed immunity and a direct path to the end, where he only needed to win 2 more challenges, being at the final 5, and had completely blown away everyone else in immunity challenges for the last few rounds, Meryl is in a position here at the final 8, in a spot where she still needs 5 more immunities if she were to get to the end here without any allies, where she is blatantly already being looked at as the biggest threat on the board. So I do feel like putting her trust in the no BS alliance here was a necessity at this point, considering, again, like, there's no way she's winning 5 immunities in a row, at least you wouldn't think so. Though I will say that playing the pass on Marion here did seem like a largely unnecessary move, as splitting the votes in this situation didn't seem like a priority here and wouldn't have gained her that much, even if the no BS alliance was loyal to her. And really it plays out in the worst possible way for her here, where through sending Marion back to camp, Marion has the wherewithal to give away her immunity, something we had seen Josh forget to do in Australians Fire, Blood vs. Water, but here we see her hand immunity to Shane, making this entire plan pointless as they can't split the vote anyway, as Killarney's the only option on the other side. Meryl ends up being taken out here after not playing her 50-50 coin, in a position where it seemed like she had a sense that she could have been in serious danger here, but I mean, like, once you're playing your pass under the assumption that the No BS Alliance is loyal to you, you kind of have to go all in at that point. I don't really fault her for not playing the 50-50 coin at this point. And she does end up having a fun exit here as well, playfully yelling out villainy and treachery and telling everyone well done as she exits the game. But Meryl's another player here that my opinion of her mostly stayed the same through this season, where, again, I always looked at her as a player that had potential, and she did demonstrate some of that potential here, playing really well for the first half of the game, but kind of just falls into the trap of her mismanaging her threat level. And again, I do feel like part of that came from her voting out Dante too early here. But Meryl is a player that didn't really exceed my expectations, considering I actually had really high expectations of her coming into this season, but she still had a solid enough run to where it does just strengthen the notion of the fact that she is a competent all-around player, though one that, again, I was expecting to be such a major contender to win the entire game coming into the season. Now for episode 17, which ends up being the next non-elimination episode, and one that, despite me thinking that the structure of this season up to this point has worked, I do feel like this stretch of the season here in particular did feel poorly paced and was the worst part of the entire season, where we essentially get two-parters back to back here, taking up an entire week of the show, making this penultimate week here come off as underwhelming, especially coming off of what was the best week of the show. Now, I will say that the gameplay of these rounds do have a lot of intrigue within them, with the final 7 and 6 rounds here in a game with the final 2 being pretty important votes and having major decisions for the players and who exactly they want to go to the end game with. But the overall pacing of them is what leaves these episodes as underwhelming to me, where there's simply just not enough compelling content to fill up 4 episodes with only 2 rounds of gameplay. But at the end of the day, while this is a complaint for the season here, it's not a major hindrance on the season, especially considering how strong it had been up until this point. Though this does end up slowing down the end game, and it makes a lot of the next few episodes just come off as filler to me. Now here we do get more of the doofusy Killarney content, with her also claiming credit for the Merrill vote, and I love the line of her saying that people are just forgetting that she was the one that came up with these moves, which, sure, I guess. But then we do get a lot of talk about the family visit, which was kind of jarring here to hear from everybody about how much they missed their family when so much of the season had been so game-bodied, where I feel like I know very little about this cast from a personal standpoint from the show itself. Where really outside of Marion talking about wanting to see her mom, it felt like none of these people's families were even mentioned up until this point. So again, all this felt very jarring, though through this we do get a genuinely heartbreaking moment here. One that I already heard about through the pregame press, but we do hear about Killarney's story of her losing both her mother and her partner back to back just shortly before the season, which is such a tragic story here, and one that you obviously have to sympathize with her over, to where obviously I mock her gameplay and do find the dodo edit she's getting here to be pretty humorous, but from a real world standpoint, I have nothing really negative to say about Killarney. I do feel like this is a really sympathetic moment for her, and a pretty impactful one as well, and one that was pretty impactful for me. But following this, we do get to the reward challenge. Again, these 2-parters do have reward challenges here because obviously they need to waste time. And here we find out that the reward is not a traditional family visit, but instead one where they'll get a video call with a loved one. And along with that comes a meal and an advantage in the next immunity challenge. And here we do see Phil win reward. And this is where Nico reveals that there is a catch, in that Phil can pick to either go by himself and get the entire reward, or give up the food and advantage to let 2 other players go with him. And for me, right away, the decision should be to take others on the trip here, which makes it a surprise to me that Phil doesn't do that. Mind you, the other players give him the permission to do so, with Shane funnily openly not wanting to go on the trip. And really, Shane throughout this challenge had some funny moments where there's this moment of Marion crying, talking about her family, and Shane makes this face as if he's annoyed while she's doing so. But Phil does decide to go on his own, which felt like a missed opportunity socially for him, as well. I get that he's hungry and that he wants this advantage in the immunity challenge. He didn't need it. He was in a pretty good spot here, so I do feel like this mostly felt like a misplay here. But this is also where we see Tajan playing the Outsurance token, to which he gets everything Phil got, including the advantage, which makes this a pretty good reward to get here. Though it doesn't end up gaining Tajan that much, considering he's out of the immunity challenge right away. But we do see them get 15 minutes to talk to their families, which was really awkward, particularly Tajan's, where he didn't even really seem to care about his family that much and cared more about seeing his dog, which was humorous. But as for the game ramifications of this, we do get a lot of talk between Phil and Tajan about them using this as a bonding session, only for Phil to be the reason why Tajan ends up going home here. So all this felt pretty pointless, and also felt like a wasted opportunity for Phil once again here, where at this point I did feel like the optimal endgame path for Phil would have been to go towards the end with the likes of Tajan and Felix, and him not pulling Tajan over to his side and eventually voting him out instead felt like a suboptimal move. And really, I do end up being perplexed with how Phil ends up playing these next few rounds, where he goes out of his way to be the one that takes Tajan out here, but also harms his relationship with Felix after the fact, despite being the one that saves him here. And also ends up harming his relationships with his new Final Four that we see come together in this episode, where we do see Marion and Dino agree to go to 4 with Phil and Shane, which is not a great spot for Phil. The Felix Tajan route being a more optimal path for him, but he still ends up ruining both of these options along the way. But here we do see Tajan and Phil talk about blindsiding Dino, and Phil admits to Dino being the biggest threat in the game and needing him gone. And I do feel like if he really wanted to here, he could have easily found a way to get Dino out. But it never seemed like that was a route that he actually considered taking here, with him seeming to want to keep the No BS alliance together, despite them clearly being fractured here, with Dino siding more towards Marion at this point, and Felix considering taking the shot at Dino, which the fact that the No BS alliance crumbles this early here was a big surprise to me, where they just pulled off 2 incredible moves back to back. And there's still 5 rounds left of the game, so to see them want to pick each other off extremely early here was a surprise, though at the same time, the Mare move did leave the group vulnerable anyway, to where I came into this round fully expecting Felix to be the next boo anyway, which is what we get initially set up here, with Marion wanting him out to further isolate Phil and Dino, and we do see Marion do some effective work here in making a proactive lie about Felix having thrown Dino's name out to get him to fully flip here, which wasn't true based on what Marion knew, but it kind of was, as we do see Felix talking to Shane and Tajan with the intention of getting the 4 with them and Phil, obviously leaving Dino out of those plans there, making it clear that both Phil and Felix didn't plan on taking Dino to the end, making this flip from Dino an actual strong move for him, even though the impotence of it was not entirely true. But this episode does bizarrely end with the immunity challenge, and not even one that gives us the results of the challenge, where it ends when it's down to the final 2 of Felix and Phil, where instantly at the beginning of the next episode, we do see Phil winning the challenge, which his advantage of starting 5 minutes after everyone else was put to good use here. But the cliffhanger here just ends up being really bizarre, with no real stakes here, and it just felt unnecessary in the result of this forced format here. But it brings us to episode 18, which for me is where the 2-parter really starts to drag, where again we waste more time on the challenge at the beginning of the episode. As I said, Phil wins the challenge, which through doing so does seem to put more of a target on his back, with him now openly being called a challenge beast. But again, at this point he is still well insulated enough in the game, with most people wanting to take him to the final 4, that it doesn't really matter that much, which makes all of his decisions moving forward in this round so puzzling to me, where he goes from being one of the best position players in the game to being the biggest target on the board, all over the course of this one individual episode. But this mismanagement of his threat level here is the first step in that. Another step towards that is what happens when they return to camp, which is while Felix, Phil, and Killarney are walking along the beach. Out of the blue, Phil finds an idol clue right in front of them and bizarrely decides to run off, not telling them anything. And really a lot of this episode ends up being dedicated to this idol hunt, with the other strategy elements being interspliced in between this. And to me, that really caused this section to feel really dragged out, as the idol hunt was spread across almost the entirety of the episode. And what made it seem even more ridiculous is the concept of this being a clue to another clue that tells you that the idol's hidden at Tribal. All of which feeling like it was set up in a way to add filler to the show, with the producers seeming to know that they were going to struggle, that they might be stretched out for content in this 2-parter here. And putting this long-winded idol hunt, putting this long-winded idol hunt here was a contingency in case that the events back at camp weren't that interesting. And again, really a lot of that makes this episode feel prolonged, because it ends up taking Phil 2 days to find this idol. But again, it is humorous that he does leave Felix and Killarney alone here, to where Killarney mentions having instigated both the Steffi and Meryl blindsides to Felix, the person who actually instigated those blindsides. It's also funny too, because later we learn that Killarney is anti-Felix because he is the one claiming the credit for the moves that she made, which makes this all feel even more ridiculous. But Idol Hunt does end up being a major knock for Phil's game here as well for me, where he really plays this really sloppily in not telling anyone about the clue as he's looking for the idol, despite Felix and Killarney seeing him find it. And through that, obviously word is going to get back to the likes of Dino, Marion, and Shane about him having a clue to the idol, to which he ends up lying to them about it, and lies to them in a ridiculous way, saying that it's a clue to an idol at the Outpost, which makes no sense considering he's still digging at camp all day. And this further burns his relationship with them, and also further severs the No BS alliance as well, where Dino ends up finding out about this clue from Killarney instead of his 2 alliance members here. further securing his plan to take out Felix. But also at the same time, we have info leaking the other way around as well, where we see Dino leaking to Shane about Marion being Felix's target, only for Shane to rat this back out to Felix, making him resolute in targeting Dino as well. But despite all this fracturing, we do see Phil trying to keep the alliance together, which I feel like was entirely pointless here. It really feels like Phil latched on to the idea of keeping the No BS alliance for a bit too long here, to where again, I feel like another one of his biggest missteps here comes from the fact that he's not fully committing to either side, which by not doing so here, he really just lets Shane, Marion, and Dino take control of the game. But through him still showing his allegiance to Felix, he becomes distrusted within that group, to where he essentially gets kicked out of the alliance by the next round. And really, I feel like Phil just got too greedy here. And I think in general, that seems to be the greatest flaw of Phil as a player, is how much he seems to recognize his best case scenario, but then tries to get that best possible outcome without recognizing the ramifications that he has to face along the way to get that. And I do feel like through saving Felix here, which even that, I debate how much of that was intentional, but through that and also how he handles the idol hunt here, it really just exemplifies that notion. But really through a lot of this conflict, what I do find strange is that despite Phil talking about taking Dino out in the last episode, it does seem like Phil now leans towards siding with Dino over Felix, and instead talks about taking him out at Final 4 or Final 5, which also seems like a terrible plan for him, with Dino being a bigger jury threat on the board than Felix, but even beyond that has way more options in the game moving forward than Felix, and is straight up a more cutthroat player than Felix as well. So the fact that Phil puts more of his trust into Dino than Felix is a mind-boggling decision for me as well, and it does seem like all this stems from the fact that Phil was looking at Felix as a loose cannon due to him going to self-preservation mode in this round, which seems apt considering it did seem like he actually was the target throughout a lot of this round. So again, I really don't get why Phil gets so upset over how Felix handled this situation, but here we do see Phil trying to build trust with Dino by showing him the idol clue, which ends up having the complete opposite effect, as Dino ends up calling him out for this as a manipulation tactic. But Phil ends up openly targeting Tajin here, which again, complete turn from the previous episode, and does so sloppily, where he does openly talk about taking Tajin out when Tajin is in hearing range, but Tajin does end up being the boot in this episode. But interestingly, there wasn't much setup for that actual boot until very late in the episode, mainly because it seems like it literally was a last second thing here. But also along the way, I did feel like Shane got a decent amount of content across this episode as well, with his continuing upward trajectory, where we do hear some pretty in-depth strategy coming from him, talking about the awareness of when he leaks information, he has to recognize the knowledge that that information can leak as well. We also have him catching Phil find the final idol clue and ratting him out to Marion, which ends up severing his bond with Marion moving forward. And we do also see more of his bond with Tajin, keeping him in the know of Felix being the target, and coming into Tribal, it did seem like the votes were going to fall on Felix. But interestingly, they do end up splitting the vote here between Felix and Tajin, which they never properly explain on the show, but right before Tribal, we get a final bit of content with Tajin saying that he's worried he's going home and decides to create a fake idol that he talks about using to stir the votes against him, which is a completely misguided plan. This makes no sense, considering the fact that the other side can split the vote. Really, that is such a damning thing in this situation, is that pretending like you have an idol only is effective in the case where the opposition can't split the vote, as they don't want to risk the chance that the idol is real and through that have one of their own members being taken out. However, in this situation where they can split the vote, this actually incentivizes them to vote you out, because now they think you have a real idol, so they want to flush that idol, either by getting rid of you or forcing you to play the idol. So again, all of this felt very misguided from Tajin's end, and we do come into Tribal, which starts off pretty fun with Felix seeming to know that he's going home and ends up trying to blow things up on his way out, which again seemed to further annoy Phil for some reason. Though eventually we do see Tajin pulling out his fake idol, which instantly we do see Marion and Dino not believing it's real, but Phil ends up maybe believing it. And really, I'm just confused on what Phil was thinking in this situation as well, where by the way that he talks about this vote, not just to the other players, but also in confessional, he seemed to truly believe Taejin's idol was real here, which, don't know how, but we do end up seeing that this actually ends up dictating the vote here, where Phil gets spooked and ends up whispering to Killarney to switch her vote to Taejin, and he votes for Taejin as well, blindsiding Taejin and keeping Felix in the game, while also blindsiding Dino, Marion, and Shane, and losing him trust with them to where, from their point of view, they look at it as he flipped the votes here to save Felix, but to him, it seems like he did it to just flush Taejin's idol, which wasn't real, and almost everyone knew it wasn't real. Again, the voting out of Taejin here from Phil's perspective is just such a questionable move on every front in my eyes. But I will say that this does provide a fantastic downfall for Taejin, with him coming off as a doofus in his exit here, with the fake idol plan seemingly causing his own downfall, instead of helping him here, with again Phil using that as an excuse to flip the vote against him. But we also get this fun moment of him getting up to play his fake idol, to which he ends up turning back, giving this overly dramatic look, pretending he is doing this like Tony-esque move of looking for reactions to gauge if he should play the idol or not, only for us to get this funny shot of the other players who have no reaction to this, making his downfall even more ridiculous here. But with that, let's talk about Taejin, who I was excited to see Taejin on this season, and I am happy to see him get a second chance here, with him being a massive fan of the game and playing in an era that didn't really appreciate his overly strategic way of playing the game. So I'm happy for him on that front, but I will say, out of maybe any of the players on this cast, to me, Taejin probably has the biggest drop in legacy. Again, he comes off as a player ahead of his time the first time around, being the strategic mastermind for a lot of Maldives, and comes off here seeming to be outclassed by a lot of the cast and being portrayed and characterized in a really doofusy way. And for him to go home here in a position where he should have been safe and seemingly cause his own demise is such a fall from grace from how I looked at him before the season, but I did still enjoy watching him on the show, largely because of how poorly he did seem to play this time around. But now for episode 19, which ends up being the last non-elimination episode of the season, with this being an even worse one than the last one in my eyes, possibly the worst episode of the entire season to me. But again, not to any extreme to where it doesn't change my opinion on the season as a whole, but we start the episode instantly seeing the ramifications of the previous vote, where again Phil flipped the vote at the last second, losing him all the trust he had with the likes of Dino and Marion, to where they now fully look at Felix and Phil as a strong duo, making them the targets moving forward, fully taking Phil out of this strong position he had been in for the last few rounds, mostly because of his severed trust between him and Marion, where he talks in confessional about how loyal he is to Marion, making it so that he is mostly blinded to how poorly positioned he ends up being here, where he still thinks that he's in this Final Four alliance, but instead the entire group is now working against him. Now for the immediate round, it doesn't matter that much, considering he obviously has an idol that does expire this round and also wins immunity anyway, but it does put him in a position where he has to win out from that point forward, especially after the Marion, Dino, Shane contingent completely outplay him here in turning Killarney against him and ended up making him complacent and taking out Felix by the end of the round as well, leaving him with no true allies moving forward. But really, a lot of this episode does feel like repetitive content from the previous episode, with a lot of that round being dedicated to Felix being the target and the No BS alliance crumbling, and what do you know, this round has Felix being the target and more of the No BS alliance crumbling, which made a lot of this round feel repetitive, which this repetitiveness really added to the mundaneness of this episode. So through that, we do end up getting more of Dino losing trust in Phil. We see Dino also doing damage control of Felix, which leads to this really awkward interaction with Felix clearly not believing a second of it. You also see Phil talk about having used Dino and Felix as shields, but now he needs to get rid of those shields, which makes no sense from my point of view. Again, it just feels like a massive misread from Phil once again, thinking that Felix is this massive jury threat that needed to be taken out immediately, when from what we've heard, while he wasn't necessarily a complete GOAT, it definitely felt like his win equity against Felix was definitely better than that against Dino or Marion, really showing how misguided he is in thinking that Marion is blindly loyal to him. But his entire plan here really seems to show how misguided he is in thinking, one, that Marion is blindly loyal to him, but also his ability to drag Killarney to the end as a GOAT here, despite her having other loyalties at this point. So it really felt like Phil had completely lost the plot here, especially where we see Phil being upset at Felix for his outlash in the previous round, and we do get to a reward challenge. again, because we need to waste time in the episode, but Phil and Felix do end up winning the reward, and on it, we get these really interactions between the two, with neither trusting the other, despite the fact that they should be trusting each other, with each other being the optimal path for them to get to the end at this point, which made these two episodes really frustrating to watch, to see these two not be able to repair their relationship. Especially because the way that Phil explains it here is that he's losing trust in Felix because Felix claims that he didn't tell anyone about Phil's clue, to which Phil doesn't believe him, which I don't get why. I mean, it's not like Felix was the only person to know about the idol. I mean, he literally showed Dino the idol clue, and also Killarney was also there with him when they found the idol clue. So again, it's just ridiculous to me that he fully blames a lot of this on Felix here. But also, while Felix and Phil are away from camp, we do see the other four come together and solidify them targeting the other two, with us interestingly getting a lot of strong content from Shane once again here, with him talking about building a bond with Killarney and wanting to take her to Final 2. And also ends up telling Killarney that Phil had been using her in the game, making Killarney talk about misjudging Shane and being thankful for him supporting her and telling her about Phil and Felix's deception. And this obviously fully brings Killarney with him, Marion, and Dino moving forward. But we also hear from Shane talking about him and now having to work with Dino as their interests are in line, and all this content from Shane was really solid, with him now having an outlined path that would lead up to his win here, which at this point did actually make me fully believe that Shane could be this WTF winner that I was actually expecting at this point. Though at the same time, Dino does get equally positive content, with his relationship with Killarney getting shown, with him really buttering her up, talking about how good her reads are in the game, and also we hear him talk about letting Shane think that he's in control. And we also see him tell the entire group about the save the date advantage, with it coming into play at the end of the episode. But this ends up further solidifying the group, who are now fully working against their one common enemy in Phil and Felix, especially after we do see them digging in Phil's bag, where they end up finding his idol, realizing how much of a threat he is in the game at this point. But we do end the episode on day 32, the day that the save the date advantage comes into play, where Dino goes to the outpost, which we see him being given a cruise, which was so funny to me. Now, again, good for Dino that he gets a cruise. Obviously, he's getting married. This is a nice honeymoon. Good for him. But as a viewer, this doesn't do anything for me. And to think that this twist that had been set up for weeks now was all just lead up to this massive commercial for their sponsor is a really funny notion to me. Though Dino does also end up getting an extra vote here as well, available to be used until the final 5, which is a decently powerful advantage considering the small numbers at this point. But considering Dino is already solidified within the majority at this point, it didn't seem to be something that would do too much for him. And really all this just came off as really underwhelming to me, where with how much they propped up the mystery of what happens on day 32, it really made it seem like it was going to be something big. I was really expecting there to be this big twist that happened, and Dino having to make a decision that played into it, but instead it just felt like this was a twist thrown in there to justify them having a two-parter, and mostly just came off as a waste of time to me. But with that, let's jump into episode 20, which again is a continuation of the last episode. Dino returns to camp and doesn't tell anyone about his vacation, as really he shouldn't, as that would just put another target on his back, but he does end up telling his alliance about his extra vote, which he ends up playing later in this round to split the vote. But following this, we do once again get some bad content for Phil, with him talking about still trusting Dino despite Dino lying to him and openly not trusting him in his confessionals. And we also see him just lie to him about what happened at the outpost, with Dino's story being that he got to practice the next immunity challenge, which is a lie that doesn't even make sense considering the eventual challenge, and also seemed like a risky lie for Dino to even tell, considering he doesn't know what the next challenge is going to be. So to me, this is just kind of a dumb lie that opened up the opportunity of him being called out for it. But we do end up seeing Phil win immunity once again here, further increasing his threat level to where Nico fully relishes in calling him a challenge beast once again here. But Phil winning immunity does put the majority alliance in an interesting spot here, where the obvious plan would be to split 2v2 on Phil and Felix, but now Phil being safe and having an idol that he can play on Felix, it does open up the opportunity of a member of the majority being taken out here. To which we do see Dino put together a contingency plan of splitting the vote onto Killarney, which we do see him eventually use his extra vote to do. Though again, this wasn't really properly explained within the episode, but it is interesting considering how much of a goat Killarney is here and how much we hear talk about people wanting to take Killarney to the end. People are still willing to vote Killarney out here, with Shane in particular being the weird one where he does go along with this plan when he talks about how his optimal move is to go to the end of Killarney. But also Killarney does continue to get more negative content here for her relationship with Marion being described as her having to babysit her and talking about using the buddy system in order to do so. But really throughout this episode, I did feel like there was very little doubt that Felix wasn't going home here, with us getting so much content focused around the plans of the newly formed Majority Alliance in the attempt to take him out. With seeing a couple of other contingency plans that they fully put together here, the most effective of which being Dino re-solidifying his bond with Phil in an attempt to get Phil to waste his idol on Dino, allowing them to take out Felix, which we do see them pull off with ease here, playing on the mistrust between Phil and Felix, and we do once again hear from Phil about how he needs to take Felix out first and then take out Dino, with the rationale being that Dino is more on board with flipping against Felix than the other way around, which again, all this is really questionable considering Felix was willing to cut Dino in the previous round, and it was Phil that convinced him not to. So again, all this felt ridiculous, but another plot thread we do get here is one that doesn't even end up mattering that much, but is a bit of an innovative move, in that Marion decides to pretend that she has an idol nullifier to scare Phil out of potentially playing the idol on Felix, which is an interesting concept and is propped up as a really effective plan, but is also one that didn't seem to make much sense when you really think about it. One, if Phil was so resolute in playing his idol on Felix as they believed him to be, considering this is the last time to play the idol and Phil also had immunity, how is this stopping him from playing the idol anyway? As at this point, if he wanted to keep Felix around, he has nothing to lose by playing it on him. But also, if Marion actually had an idol nullifier here, why would she just announce it to everyone before she actually ends up playing it? That completely takes away the power from the idol nullifier, to where the only reason to reveal it before you end up playing it is to fake someone out into thinking you're going to play the idol nullifier. So if Marion actually had the idol nullifier in this position, she gains nothing from telling people about it, as really the idol nullifier is an all-powerful advantage that just straight up allows you to take out whoever your target is. And really, all this should have made it even more obvious to Phil that they were lying about the idol nullifier. So again, I do feel like this was an interesting idea from Marion, but one that doesn't actually carry much weight when you really think about it. But to be fair, not really sure if many of them did at the point that she sprung it up on them. But the vote ends up going as expected, with Phil playing his idol on Dino, and the split still going through as expected, leading to a revote where Felix gets voted out. But also interesting note here is the fact that after the vote off, we do see Dante from the jury message over to Shane about taking Dino out, which rules wise, I mean, this is certainly wonky, where there obviously shouldn't be any direct communication between the jury members and the players, but it's also something really tough to enforce here, though this does end up making it pretty apparent that Dino is one of the biggest jury threats on the board, though also makes it weird that Dante wants him out from the jury at this point, where you would think that he would want to reward the person that he had constantly called the biggest threat as a way to prove himself as being right, but I guess that's not the way he looked at it. But either way, we do lose Felix here, who I did end up enjoying on this season, despite him being one of the more questionable casting choices for me coming into the season. And I do feel like he was really effective in shaking up his game from last time, being able to hold back his domineering personality that overtook him in his first appearance, and pull off some of the biggest moves in the entire season, where I would 100% credit most of the Steffi move to him, which is a move of the quality that I never expected Felix to actually be able to execute. Felix really just ends up improving his reputation in almost every possible way on the return here. That makes him one of the most improved players on the return, and one of the biggest surprises as well, though he certainly had his missteps in his last few rounds. Now for episode 21, which does end up being a weirdly structured episode where it felt like the producers knew that they wouldn't have enough content for the final 5 rounds. They ended up finishing that round about 2/3 of the way through the episode, and they end up starting the final 4 round here as well, which I actually don't mind too much. Where for me, it's like, as long as there is an elimination within the episode, and considering it's also 4-episode-a-week structure, I really didn't mind the change in the format here, especially considering what they had to work with. Now, we do start the episode seeing Dino and Phil talk, with Phil now knowing that Dino doesn't trust him. And this was an interesting conversation to see these two that had worked together so closely throughout most of the game, openly acknowledging to each other that they can't take each other to the end, which I feel like is a conversation you don't typically see. To see these two players being so forthright in what they plan for their own end games. But after this, we do see the players getting tree mail, where each player gets a word scramble that ends up being a clue to an advantage to the immunity challenge, turning out that SA has taken this same twist from Survivor 41 and 42, which felt very random to me, and it once again ends up just wasting time on the episode, where Shane ends up winning this advantage, and, or alert, he doesn't win the challenge, a challenge that we get so much setup to Phil needing to win it. And it does end up being the counting competition, which wasn't an ideal spot here due to how easy it is to collude here. And we do end up seeing everyone working together except for Phil. But Phil ends up winning anyway here. And with that, Dino should have been the easy target on the board, especially with Phil being fully on board with voting Dino out. And also considering the fact that we had heard about Shane wanting to go to the end with Killarney, I was fully expecting throughout a lot of this episode that Shane was going to flip the script on Dino, but it never ends up happening here. Instead, we end up seeing Dino come up with a plan to blindside Phil by voting out Killarney, obviously keeping the Dino, Shane, Marion contingent together, while also trying to show the jury how out of the loop Phil is. Now, Phil also ends up winning a reward with this, which he ends up sharing with Marion, that does lead to him campaigning against Dino to her, which we instantly see her not being on board with, but she does end up creating another plot here involving fake advantages that she wants to execute to make Phil think that she is still working with him, where she comes up with this plan to pretend that Dino had gotten a vote steal at the Outpost, and that Marion gets her vote stolen so that they can pretend that Marion is still on his side, which for Marion, it makes sense why she would obviously want to do this under the case that Phil wins out, but I don't get why Dino allowed her to do this, as it really seems counterproductive for him. But even beyond that, this is another plan here that doesn't actually make any sense if you really think about it, where every time a vote steal had been played in the past, you have to openly announce it before the vote. As for a vote steal in particular here, it is necessary for you to reveal who you are using it on, as that person will not be allowed to vote. Meaning that unless you're able to tell the producers who you're using it on before tribal, or they stack the voting order in order to have the vote stealer vote first and make their decision then, none of this actually makes any practical sense. But again, don't think Phil was thinking all this through, but even beyond that, we do end up seeing Marion initially campaign to Phil about why Killarney should be the target, that when he sees that Killarney goes home, it should make it even more obvious to him that she had been working against him here. But on the way out, we do get more Dodo content for Killarney, with Dino calling her out for having a warped perception of reality. But then we get to tribal, again only halfway through the episode, making it clear that there was going to be more to come afterwards. But we do get talk of an interesting stat about this final 5 here, in that 4 of them do end up coming from SA champions, with 3 of them coming from the original Utara tribe, which is kind of insane how well the players from champions ended up doing here, especially considering most of the fan base has not seen that season, which hopefully brings more attention to that season moving forward. But all this does lead to Marion's plan going off without a hitch, and Killarney being blindsided in a 3-2 vote. But again, it's not the end of the episode just yet, as we do have to start the final 4 round here, starting off with a similar scene to the one that we started the episode with, where we do see Dino and Phil talk once again early in the morning, with again the sportsmanship between the two here being pretty fun, but we do see them kind of reconcile and talking about potentially working together and talking about how big of a threat Marion is. And we have Dino saying it'd be insane for him to take Marion to the end, which makes all this work that Marion did to keep Phil on her side, while effective in the sense that Phil does believe this vote steal story, it didn't seem to matter enough to where he still doesn't want to go to the end with her anyway. But the episode does end with a reward challenge, with it being one that we had seen before on Survivor Ghost Island, essentially being a paired version of Samotion, and we do end up seeing Phil and Dino pair up, while Marion and Shane pair up, and really I found a lot of this challenge really boring here, which really made the cliffhanger of this episode kind of lackluster. Before moving on, let's talk about Killarney, who again, coming into this season, I really did not see any real potential in Killarney. Seeing her the first time around, I never really expected her to be a good player at any point, despite the fact that she does get unfairly treated there. But I feel like this season further cements that Killarney's just simply bad at the game. I mean, she seems to have a misconception of how to play the game, to where she just thinks the brief mentioning of an idea means that she orchestrated an entire move. And worst of all, she was looked at as a GOAT from really early on in the game, where even before the merge, it seemed like a common assumption that if you go to the end of Killarney, you will win. Which makes it even more insane that no one actually goes for the opportunity. But I did like what Killarney brought to the show here, being this wild card in a similar way to how Abby Maria had to be dealt with across Second Chance, though obviously not as bombastic of a player. But now for episode 22, which was a mostly straightforward episode that starts right away with Shane and Marion winning the reward, and their overall reward experience here was mostly boring, being this typical sentimental content, though I will say that seeing Shane and Marion here, the same Shane and Marion we saw in Champions, now all these years later, being at this reward here together and still being in the game together at this point was all really insane to see here. Especially coming into the season, I never would have expected them to perform as well as they did. But back at camp, we do get a lot of content between Dino and Phil, with a lot of it feeling like a swan song to Phil, which while they do create a plan to oust Marion by using a 2-1-1 vote, it never felt like that was actually a possibility, especially with Dino telling us in confessional while this plan is being made that this is only a backup plan in the case that Phil wins immunity, which I already assumed wasn't going to happen, as really just at this point it felt like the perfect timing for Phil to be voted out here from a storytelling perspective, but also felt like the right time for his immunity run to end. And right before the challenge, we do also strangely get a lot of content from Shane talking about how important this challenge is, and what do you know, he ends up winning immunity, which through doing so really just seals Phil's fate here, with him not really having a leg to stand on. But along the way, we do also get a lot of time with each member of the Final Four, with us getting some pretty powerful confessionals from Marion propping up her game, and we get this great moment at Tribal of her talking about not wanting to win because of her story, to which the jury seemed to be really impressed by. We then also have Dino getting emotional confessional over getting so close and the chance of him crashing and burning, really showing how much he wants it here. Though I will say that with the jury seeming to love what Marion said, and also just applaud seeing Shane once he reveals that he had immunity, it did end up putting some doubt in my mind that Dino would even end up winning the game if he even got to the end here, making this confessional actually sound like a possibility at this point. But again, I did love seeing these final scenes between Phil and Dino that felt like a great culmination to their relationship, though obviously by the time of the vote itself, it does end up becoming a unanimous Phil vote. And Phil was such a pleasant surprise on this season. While I do have some reservations with some of his strategic ideas at points, I didn't think Phil had it in him coming into this season to play the quality of game that he ended up playing here. Especially when coming into the season, he seemed like a major wild card and seemed like a player that could have flamed out. But really coming into the final 7 here, I felt like he was playing a pretty incredible game, to where he had faced so much adversity and he had been able to take control of the game despite playing from behind for a lot of it. But again, I do feel like he made a lot of questionable decisions from that point forward, but still proved himself to be a solid player and also ends up being an incredible character, with him giving a really fun energy to his confessionals that do make him stand out on this season, in particular considering the fact that so much of the season is focused around gameplay and strategy. So to have this lightheartedness that Phil brought to the show here while still being an extremely active player really made him one of the stars of this season. Now for episode 23, the penultimate episode of the season, which starts with the final 3 looking at the sunrise and each getting to talk about their journeys, with Shane getting content here talking about how the jury is stacked in his favor, and his constant talk about his jury chances, one made him look like a lock to make it to the end, but did also leave me a bit unsure if we were being set up for a win, a good final tribal performance that would get him close to a win, or for him to completely bomb at Final Tribal, and really I feel like any of these scenarios seem realistic at this point. Marion gets propped up as having found peace and being confident in the game that she played, setting her up even further to be the biggest threat to win the game at this point, which made it seem like she was being prepped to be sniped out of the game at this point. But then we get Dino, who talks about finding confidence, and that ends up being a prominent theme in his content moving forward. But then we get to the final immunity challenge, which right away was disappointing that we didn't get hands on the hard idol. I do feel like that's the definitive final immunity challenge, and it would have been great to have that for the first All-Star season here. But instead, the final immunity challenge that we get here is the final challenge from Survivor Fiji for some reason, which again was random and one I didn't like nearly as much, considering it heavily relies on upper body strength, to where coming into it, I felt like Dino's body type would give him a massive advantage in this challenge. But before the actual challenge itself, we do end up finding out that this is where we are getting the family visit. Obviously a similar format to what we have seen in Australian Survivor, which obviously fills up more time in the episode, which they kind of needed. Though I will say that they did provide for some great moments from Marion, finally getting her mom out there after talking about it all season. We get Dino seeing his fiance, and we get Shane seeing his friend, which that, along with Shane's overall demeanor throughout this entire scene, was really funny to me, with him being mostly straight-faced while the other two were extremely emotional. But as for the challenge, I mean, we do see Shane and Dino struggling right away, but Marion still ends up being the first to drop, and when Dino ends up winning here, we get this big reaction from him that was pretty nice to see, and right away he goes up to his fiance and he does tell her that he is voting Marion out, which had obviously been set up for rounds now, and the show doesn't even try to hide the fact that Dino is pretty dead set on voting her out at this point, and neither Marion or Shane even try to convince him either way. But then we get to this great moment of Dino revealing to Marion that he is going to be voting her out. We do hear this theme of confidence coming up once again, with Dino saying that this move can be looked at as a cowardly one, but it's his job to change that perception into making it look like a strategic one instead. And we do get this debate between the two at Tribal as well, but through this, Marion essentially implies that her and Dino are the two best there, which does end up bothering Shane moving forward. But we do get some great jury reactions along the way, with Dante still being upset that people didn't listen to him, and we do see Steffi getting emotional that Marion is going home here, and we even see the jury stand up and applaud Marion as she walks out, with the exception of Dante, who remains seated for most of it. But this does give us a bizarre final two here in Dino versus Shane, which had been previously set up. And I did feel pretty confident during the endgame stretch that Shane for sure was going to make final two, but just seeing that these two are the final two here was really weird, considering their hostile relationship for most of the game. And while we did hear from Shane about how his and Dino's interests do align, it never felt like they were that solid of a pairing here. To the point where when we're seeing these one-on-one interactions with just the two of them here, it did feel very unnatural to me. But it does end up being an interesting final two, where I didn't fully know who was going to win. Now, obviously, Dino did seem like the odds-on favorite, being this figure that was talked about as a big threat along the way, but it did feel like Shane had some solid relationships and had been talking up his Final Tribal skills to the point where I wouldn't have been surprised to see Shane pull it out either. But the episode obviously doesn't end there, as we still had about a third of the episode left, and to be honest, it does lead to a bit of an unnatural ending point for the episode to me. But along the way, we do get to see the two of them have their breakfast and prepare for their speeches, with Dino talking about this being a superfan's dream, and we see him writing down the boot order and preparing himself to talk about the flow of the game, and also his personal journey along the way. While we do see Shane talk about how he knows he's the underdog and wants to go into Final Tribal, talking about his duality while in the game, leading us to Final Tribal, where the episode does end after the opening statements, where we do see Shane do a pretty solid job here in talking about his personal relationships with the likes of Tajin and Steffi and Killarney. He talks about being hurt by what Marion said, and really all this revealing his emotional side is something that we haven't really seen from Shane up to this point. And we even see the jury clapping for him at the end of this, and while it did seem to be working here, it still came off to me to be in a similar light to how Spencer from Survivor Cambodia talked about how he was moving from a cold strategist to focusing on relationships, which obviously ended up being ineffective for him, but I do think it seemed a bit more genuine from Shane here, but then we get to see Dino talking about his personal journey, and a lot of it felt very Stephen Fishback-y at the beginning, though he does end up propping his game along the way as well, having this great line of talking about being sorry for the hurt he caused, but not for the decisions he made. And he does also have this fun moment of pulling out Shona's idol to further support the way that he played the game, which was a nice payoff to that storyline. But the episode ends again pretty abruptly here, which did make it feel very jarring and did lose some of the momentum that had been built up to this point, though I obviously get why they had to do it. But before moving on, let's talk about the boot from this episode in Marion, who obviously played a very solid game on this season. While there were a few spots here and there that she was out of the loop, everyone on this season was out of the loop at some point across the game. And I do feel like in the endgame stretch here, Marion was playing the best game on the board. She seemed to be adored by the jury. She had the social connections that ingrained her in the game, and was also one of the lead strategic figures in the game. Now, I do think her endgame positioning was a little lacking, in that outside of Shane, I don't think anyone was ever actually considering taking her to the end by the time of the final 8. But for her to get to that final 3 with the only person that would consider it is still impressive work as well. Also, I do feel like her personal journey across the season was interesting to watch, seeing her play again after her vitiligo diagnosis, which other players looked at as a weakness early on, but surpassing that and playing a really strong game that earned the jury's respect in its own right. And again, overall, she had a great story across this season, and for her to fall short here, I do think is an overall boon to her legacy to me, making her by far the best final juror in Survivor SA history, and making her the you should have won person for the season. Now for the finale, episode 24, which the core episode was entirely revolved around the jury questioning, which I will say did go on for a while, and I'll be honest, I did find most of it pretty boring. I mean, we did get talk of the heart versus head debate, with Dino seeming to be the option that most people seem to recognize as having played the stronger game, but players like Steffi and Tajan seem to have better personal relationships with Shane. And just in general, I really was surprised at how vulnerable Shane was throughout a lot of this tribal, with him talking about having lost his will to live and how this experience has restored his faith in humanity. And really all this felt like a very different Shane from what we had seen previously in Champions. And along the way, Dino also gets very emotional, seemingly genuinely remorseful over the hurt that he has caused by playing the game he played. And really, I liked both performances here. I feel like they both played this final tribal pretty solidly, but I didn't feel like any of the questions here ended up being particularly notable. But then we get to the voting, and I did love seeing the camaraderie between Dino and Shane here, with each propping each other up as the votes were cast. But then we get the reveal that the winner will be revealed on location. But before doing so, we need to continue with the Australian Survivor format by having the family members come in to be there during the vote reveal, which again I hate, but I do feel like this was handled better than how it's handled in Australian Survivor, where they just come out and we go straight to the vote. We don't waste time in asking them questions. So again, I feel like this was better. But during this, you can clearly tell that Shane knew that he had lost, and we get to the votes, finding out that Killarney and Steffi voted for Shane, while the other 7 go for Dino, in a position where throughout the jury questioning, I was pretty confident by the way they were asking their questions that they were leaning Dino. It did seem pretty clear that he was going to get the win by this point, though coming into Final Tribal, I did feel like there was a chance for Shane, and then possibly being able to pull in the votes of Tajan, Marion, and maybe Dante, but Dino seemed to do a really good job in maintaining Marion and Dante's votes and swinging over Tajan along the way, giving him the win, and we get a fun reaction from him. And really, I'm just really happy for Dino here. I mean, clearly this means a lot to him, and for him to have his mediocre experience from last time and be able to come on the show this time and really just get the most out of the experience here. I mean, winning the game, getting a car, breaking the car curse, also winning a vacation. It really just ends up being a good experience for him all around. But following the vote reveal, we do also get the reveal that we're going to have a reunion show, which I was under the assumption that the reunion show was going to be a more traditional one, but then we find out that they are actually taking inspiration from Survivor 41 and 42 and having the reunion show on the island, which initially did worry me, as I'm not a fan of how the US handled those reunions. But with Survivor SA actually being run by actual fans of the show, I love how they handled the reunion here, really fixing all the issues I have with the US after show, where this isn't immediately after the vote reveal, it's instead a day later, where each of the players are able to decompress in that time and also be able to shower and dress up and look the way they would typically look at a normal reunion. But also we had the pre-jury there as well, and I feel like we got to spend a decent amount of time with each of the cast members. I mean, there was literally a part in the reunion where they go one by one asking each person what they got out of the experience. I did overall really enjoy the reunion here, and I do hope that the US learns from this and is able to do this format moving forward, though they probably won't because they're pretty stubborn. But with that, let's wrap up the review here by talking about the final two, starting off with Shane, who I genuinely can't believe that the Shane that we saw in Champions was able to come back to Survivor almost 10 years later and end up getting all the way to the end of the game only to lose in a jury vote, and seemingly would have lost against most of the endgamers here, which is like an insane thought to think about. But Shane had a really rocky run here. Now, from a storytelling perspective, I am still pretty conflicted on how his run was portrayed here, where he did end up being pretty under-edited, especially in comparison to a lot of the other endgamers, where Dino, Mary, and Phil were by far the three main characters of the season. But also within the content that Shane ends up getting here, there's a lot of just inconsistencies in how he was portrayed, where I really feel like for most of the show, really up until the tail end, he was still being shown as this like cutthroat, business-like figure that seemed to be one of the most tapped in to the actuality of them playing the game. But then he isn't by the end of it. I mean, he has this easy path to a win in taking Killarney and doesn't go that route, and instead becomes the GOAT that everyone wants to take to the end because they think they have the best chance of beating him, which is just such a strange way for his story to end to me. But I did really like seeing Shane on the return here. Again, I feel like his cold demeanor brought a lot of fun character moments for him, and it was really interesting to see him have this very rocky first round and having other people see through his game very early on, only for him to still make a deep run in the game in what is still a somewhat solid game. Again, it's not a terrible game of Survivor that he played here, but one that definitely needed a few modifications if he was going to pull out the win. And now let's talk about our winner here in Dino, my winner pick, so I did get that right, but Dino ends up playing a pretty strong game here. A game where he took control of his original tribe, only to then get swapped into a really bad position and is still able to scrape his way through it. And then in the post-merge, him and a No BS alliance were able to strike at the perfect opportunity, flipping the power structure. He then later flips when he recognizes that he's on the bottom of the No BS alliance into a position where Marion is fully loyal to him until 3, to the point where he's even able to get them to vote out Killarney over him, which is just insane. And then he obviously wins the very important final immunity challenge that allows him to take out Marion and gives him the win. I mean, Dino plays a very solid game here, not an overtly dominant one where he's in control the entire time, but he certainly had control at points, and even when he didn't, he did have a lot of agency in him securing his position within the game through maintaining some really strong relationships. Mind you, some of those might have come from pregame, but I don't really hold that as a major negative against him, especially because I don't think there's a major instance of that really saving his game here. So as a winner, again, Dino for me is a pretty strong one for SA standards. I mean, he's not in the ranks of Rob Bentley or even a Graham, but I do think it solidly lands him as the show's third best winner in my eyes. In the grand scheme of Survivor, probably a winner hovering around the top of the middle tier, probably around the likes of a Chris Doherty or a Nick Wilson. These winners that were not always in control, but did have strong moves to call their own and also faced a decent amount of adversity along the way, and were still able to overcome that. But with that, that is the entire season of Survivor South Africa Return of the Outcasts. A really strong season of the show that ends up really exceeding the terrible format that the network forced upon them. And while I do find the consequences of that format to be the biggest negatives for this season, I still enjoyed the ride despite that. And really, even then, the format didn't really bother me until the last couple weeks of the show, and that doesn't really harm my overall opinions of the season. I do feel like this season's quality is still in line with the last few seasons of Survivor SA, and while it dragged out a bit in the endgame, I was still invested in what was going on in this season, largely because of the aspect of these being returning players, these people having redemption arcs, and to me when I think of this season, I do compare it a lot to Survivor Cambodia. I do feel like the two seasons have massive commonalities, being returning seasons based around the concept of giving these players redemption arcs, being seasons with hyper-strategic gameplay that did end up being a bit game-body throughout a lot of it. But I will say I do feel like even this season was able to show that gameplay to the viewer in a more concise way than Second Chance was. And while I do think the show is lacking a personal touch for a lot of the season, I do think they started to course correct that towards the end of the season, especially when we had more time to play with. So again, I do find this to be a really strong season, really showcasing once again why Survivor South Africa is the best version of Survivor currently airing, and keeping the season in line with the likes of SA Philippines and SA Immunity Island, which to me are the two best seasons of Survivor SA before this. But with that is my review of Survivor SA Return of the Outcasts, my now new longest review I've ever done. Now, like previous seasons, I do intend on following this up with a player ranking for the season, so stay tuned for that. Also, at some point before next season, I would like to redo my top 10 players of all time for Survivor SA, so stay tuned for that as well. I'll also be doing reviews of the other shows that are currently running, like BB24, The Challenge USA, A&W for anyone that cares about that. So stay tuned for those. Also, Survivor 43 is right around the corner, and obviously I'll be covering that in a similar light to how I covered this as well. So stay tuned for all those things. But for now, that is the video. Thank you for watching.